I put on a catering uniform to protect my daughter, expecting only to test the man she loved. But while pouring drinks in the shadows, I heard one single sentence that shattered her engagement and revealed a monstrous secret he planned to bury right after the wedding. The collar of the cheap white tuxedo shirt was digging fiercely into my neck. I am 68 years old, and my knees were already barking from carrying a heavy silver tray loaded with crystal champagne flutes for the past 3 hours. The air inside the Oak Ridge Country Club was thick with the smell of expensive cologne, roasted prime rib, and old money arrogance. Women draped in diamonds and men stuffed into tailored suits glided past me, treating me like a piece of furniture. To them, I was just another hired hand, an invisible servant brought in to keep their glasses full at the social event of the season. They had no idea who was actually pouring their drinks. My name is Harrison Caldwell. To the people in my hometown, I am just an old man who prefers faded denim jeans, a comfortable pair of work boots, and a 2004 Ford truck with a dent in the tailgate. But behind the scenes, I am the sole founder and owner of Caldwell Syndication and Sound. For 40 years, I built a national radio and recording studio empire from the ground up. I am worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I practice what you might call silent wealth. I do not flash my money. I do not buy luxury sports cars or massive yachts. I invest quietly, I build structural security, and above all else, I protect my family. And my family is exactly why I was sweating in that stiff tuxedo tonight. My daughter Chloe was 28 years old, with a heart of pure gold and a trusting nature that scared me to death. Tonight was her engagement party. She was celebrating her upcoming marriage to Preston Sterling. Preston was a flashy commercial real estate developer. He drove a pristine imported sports car, wore suits that cost more than some people make in a year, and talked constantly about his massive property deals and offshore investments. To the outside world, he seemed like the perfect catch for a smart, beautiful young woman. But something deep in my gut, a quiet alarm bell that had kept me alive in the cutthroat broadcasting business, told me that Preston was an absolute fraud. Fathers have an instinct. You can look at a man and sense if he has a solid foundation or if he is just a house of cards waiting to collapse under the first strong wind. Preston was far too smooth. He always had the right answer, the perfect compliment, the flawless excuse. When he looked at Chloe, I did not see genuine love or partnership. I saw cold calculation. I saw a man assessing a valuable asset. I could not just confront Chloe with my suspicions. She was completely under his spell. She believed he was her Prince Charming, a successful businessman who wanted to take care of her forever. If I marched in and accused him without concrete proof, she would think I was just a bitter, overprotective old man trying to ruin her happiness. I needed to see how Preston acted when he thought nobody important was watching. People reveal their true nature to those they consider completely beneath them. So I used my connections with a local catering company I had secretly funded years ago, pulled a few strings, and got myself assigned to the waitstaff for the evening. I watched from the perimeter of the grand ballroom, keeping my head down and my tray perfectly balanced. Chloe was glowing in a simple ivory dress, laughing and talking with guests. She looked so much like her late mother, Sarah, that it made my chest ache with a profound, heavy sorrow. Sarah and I had built our empire together, and on her deathbed, I promised her I would always shield our little girl from the vultures of the world. Seeing Chloe so happy tonight almost made me doubt my own instincts. Preston stood beside her, playing the part of the devoted fiancé perfectly. He held her hand, kissed her cheek, and charmed her friends with practiced ease. But from my vantage point in the shadows, I noticed how his eyes constantly darted around the room, taking inventory of who was wealthy, who was influential, and who was useless to him. Around 10 o'clock, the party started winding down. The older, wealthier guests were leaving, and the younger crowd was migrating toward the dance floor, and the open bar. I saw Preston slip away from Chloe, giving her a quick, practiced excuse about needing to check on the valet service for his parents. Instead of heading to the front doors, he walked down a dimly lit, secluded hallway toward the private cigar lounge. A moment later, his father, Richard Sterling, followed him. Richard was a man cut from the exact same cloth as his son, always projecting an image of vast generational wealth, but with a gaze that felt slippery, desperate, and cold. I grabbed a fresh tray of drinks and followed them at a safe distance. The hallway was completely quiet, lined with heavy oak paneling and antique oil paintings that absorbed the distant sound of the band. The heavy wooden door to the cigar lounge was left slightly ajar. I stopped just outside, pressing my back against the textured wallpaper hiding completely in the shadows. My heart started to beat faster, thudding against my ribs like a warning drum. I told myself I was just being a paranoid old man, that I would probably just hear them discussing golf scores or bragging about the extravagant wedding budget. I took a slow, silent breath and leaned my head closer to the narrow crack in the door to listen. The heavy, pungent smell of expensive tobacco smoke drifted out into the hallway. Preston sounded highly agitated, his voice stripped of all the charming polish he had displayed in the ballroom. "You need to keep the bank off my back for just 3 more months," Preston snapped angrily. "Tell them whatever they want to hear. Lie to the board if you have to." Richard let out a heavy, exhausted sigh. "I am out of excuses, Preston. The federal auditors are circling the firm like sharks. The Securities and Exchange Commission is breathing down my neck, and your commercial real estate accounts are entirely frozen. We are bleeding cash by the second. If we do not inject massive capital into the holding company by the end of the quarter, we are both going to federal prison. Are you absolutely certain this girl has access to the principal balance of her trust?" I froze completely. My grip on the silver tray tightened so fiercely my knuckles turned stark white. My daughter. They were talking about my innocent Chloe. Preston laughed. It was a dark, nasty, hollow sound that made my stomach churn with physical nausea. "I have seen the financial disclosures from her family lawyers," Preston said. "Her trust fund unlocks the exact day we get married. It is completely unencumbered cash. And the best part, she does not suspect a single thing. She thinks I am the one with all the money. She is so wrapped up in her little charity projects, she does not even look at the numbers." "What about her father?" Richard asked, his voice tight with sudden anxiety. "Harrison Caldwell is no fool. I have heard serious rumors about the actual size of his syndication empire downtown. If he audits your financials before the wedding, we are finished." Harrison Preston scoffed with sheer unadulterated contempt. "The old man is just a country radio hick. He drives a garbage truck and wears dirty flannel to business meetings. He has absolutely no idea how high-level corporate restructuring works. He is a dinosaur from a bygone era. I will blind him with a few pages of dense legal jargon, and he will just nod along like an obedient dog." I stopped breathing. The sheer arrogance, the absolute malice in his voice was paralyzing. This man was not marrying my daughter out of love. He was using her as a human shield against federal indictments. He viewed my family as nothing more than a bank to rob. "So what is the exact timeline?" Richard pressed, sounding desperate for a lifeline. "As soon as the ink dries on the marriage certificate," Preston stated with chilling calculation. "I am funneling her entire trust fund directly into our Cayman shell accounts to cover the massive deficits. We pay off the indictments, we clear the immediate corporate debt, and we secure our own offshore assets. I will string the girl along for a few months, maybe a year, just to make the marriage look legitimate to the authorities. And then, Preston said, his voice dripping with cruel amusement, I will file for a sudden divorce. I will claim irreconcilable differences. By the time her hick father figures out what happened, the money will be completely untraceable offshore. I will leave the girl entirely burdened with the remaining corporate debt, and we walk away completely clean. The world seemed to stop spinning on its axis. The hallway tilted dangerously beneath my feet. Every drop of warm blood in my veins turned to absolute ice. My vision narrowed until all I could see was the heavy wooden door separating me from the absolute monster who was planning to systematically destroy my child. He was going to steal her future, saddle her with federal corporate debt, ruin her pristine credit, and throw her away like garbage. And he was going to do it all with a handsome smile on his face right under my nose. I was consumed by a sudden violent surge of primal rage. A physical tremor started deep in my chest and traveled rapidly down my arms. I wanted to kick the heavy oak door completely off its hinges. I wanted to grab Preston by his expensive silk tie and drag him out into the center of the ballroom. I wanted to expose him in front of every single elite guest and beat him within an inch of his life for daring to target my little girl. I wanted to show him exactly what a country radio hick could do when his family was threatened. But my hands were shaking too violently to control. The heavy silver tray in my grip tipped forward. A crystal champagne flute slid slowly, inevitably off the polished edge. The glass hit the solid marble floor. It shattered with a sharp, explosive crack that echoed loudly down the silent hallway like a gunshot. What was that? Preston demanded sharply from inside the lounge. I heard the loud scrape of a heavy leather chair being pushed back quickly. Panic shot through my entire nervous system. If he walked out and saw me standing there in a waiter's uniform listening at the door, the entire game would be over instantly. He was a master manipulator. He would invent a lie on the spot, claim I was spying on him out of irrational jealousy, and twist the entire narrative to make me look like an insane, controlling father trying to sabotage his daughter's life. Chloe, sweet and trusting Chloe, would take his side. I would lose her forever, and he would still get exactly what he wanted. I turned and ran. I pushed desperately through the swinging double doors leading into the main catering kitchens, just as I heard the cigar lounge door swing open behind me. I ducked hard behind a massive stainless steel prep station, my heart hammering against my ribs so forcefully it physically ached. "Hey," Preston's arrogant voice barked out to a nearby teenage busboy in the hallway. "Was someone just standing outside the lounge?" "Just one of the older waiters, sir," the boy replied nervously. He dropped a glass and went back to the kitchen to get a broom to clean it up. I heard Preston mutter a vile curse under his breath before his heavy footsteps retreated back down the hall and the lounge door clicked shut. I leaned heavily against the cold metal counter, closing my eyes tightly, trying to force oxygen back into my burning lungs. The kitchen was a blur of frantic activity all around me. Chefs were shouting orders, dishwashers were clattering porcelain plates, and ovens were hissing with steam. But all I could hear was Preston's cold, calculating laughter playing on an endless, torturous loop in my mind. My daughter was marrying a predator. The wedding date was set for exactly 3 months away. 90 days. That was all the time I had left to save her from financial and emotional ruin. If I confronted him right now, I had nothing but my word against his. He was a professional liar who lied to federal agencies for a living. He would weave a story so convincing that Chloe would walk right into his trap willingly. I could not act on raw, explosive emotion. I had built a massive corporate empire by being patient, by silently observing my rivals, and by striking only when I had absolute, undeniable legal and financial leverage. I reached up, pulled the cheap black bow tie away from my sweaty neck, and tossed it angrily into a nearby trash can. Preston Sterling thought I was just a country radio hick. He thought I was a naive, uneducated old man who could be easily blinded by corporate structures and legal paperwork. He had vastly underestimated the man he was dealing with. He thought he was playing a rigged game of chess with an absolute fool. He had no idea that I owned the entire board. I walked quietly out the back service exit of the country club, stepping into the cool, dark night air. I looked up at the stars shining above the sprawling golf course, thinking of my late wife, Sarah, and the sacred promise I made to her to always keep our daughter safe from harm. A cold, heavy iron resolve settled deep into my bones, replacing the initial shock and panic. I was not going to throw a single physical punch. I was not going to raise my voice or cause a public scene tonight. I was going to use every single ounce of my silent wealth, every corporate connection I had forged over 4 decades, and every legal weapon at my disposal to systematically dismantle Preston Sterling's entire life. I would let him think he was winning. I would let him smile and play the perfect groom right up until the very last possible second. And then I would tear his world apart piece by piece, leaving him and his father with absolutely nothing but the prison sentences they deserved. The cool night air hitting my face felt like a physical blow. I stumbled across the manicured asphalt of the country club parking lot, ripping the cheap clip-on bow tie from my collar and tossing it onto the pristine grass. My lungs burned. My chest heaved. I finally reached my 2004 Ford truck parked in the far back lot next to the massive green dumpster bins. I yanked the heavy metal door open, threw my aching 68-year-old frame into the driver's seat, and slammed the door shut. The silence inside the cab was absolute and deafening. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white. I pressed my forehead against the worn leather wrapping of the wheel and tried to force my breathing to slow down. The words I had just heard echoing from the private cigar lounge kept replaying in my mind like a scratched record. Funneling her trust fund, file for divorce, leave the girl with the debt. It was a calculated nightmare disguised as a high society engagement. I sat back heavily against the fabric seat and looked over at the empty passenger side. In my mind, I could still clearly see my late wife, Sarah, sitting right there. She always loved riding in this old, beat-up truck. We bought it the year our syndication company finally hit the national markets, and the money really started rolling in. But long before the corporate accounts and the massive studio headquarters, we had absolutely nothing but each other, and a relentless dream. Sarah and I started out 35 years ago, with a single struggling AM radio station operating out of a cinder block building with a leaky roof in rural Tennessee. I was the audio engineer, the maintenance guy, and the janitor. Sarah was the sales director, the voice of the morning broadcast, and the absolute heart of the entire operation. We ate cold sandwiches at a cheap folding table while splicing audio tapes late into the night. We poured every single dime we had into better transmitters, clearer signals, and broader reach. We built Caldwell syndication and sound with blistered hands late notices on our electricity bills and countless sleepless nights. It was not inherited wealth. It was not a fraudulent scheme built on borrowed leverage. It was blood sweat and absolute dedication to the craft of broadcasting. Sarah was my guiding light. She taught me that true power was not in raising your voice or showing off your bank account, but in knowing the truth and standing firm. When we finally made our first $1 million, Sarah did not go out and buy a massive diamond ring or a European sports car. She quietly paid off the residential mortgages of our 3 oldest, most loyal employees. That was the legacy she wanted to leave for our family. She believed in silent wealth, in using your blessings to create a strong foundation for the people you love. And then I thought about the cold, sterile hospital room. 6 years ago, the doctors sat us down and told us the aggressive treatments were no longer working. The cancer had taken almost everything from Sarah, except her fierce, unyielding love for our family. I remember sitting beside her hospital bed, holding her frail hand in mine, while the monitors beeped a slow, steady rhythm that marked the inevitable end of my entire world. Sarah looked at me with eyes that were tired, but incredibly sharp. "Harrison, she whispered, her voice barely carrying across the quiet room. "Chloe has my heart, but she does not have your armor. She sees the good in everyone, even when it is completely absent. You have to protect her. Promise me you will stand between her and the wolves. Promise me you will never let anyone use her kindness against her." I promised her. I wept openly, kissed her forehead, and swore on my life that our daughter would always be safe. Sitting in my truck, now staring at the distant, glittering lights of the country club ballroom, I felt a wave of profound, suffocating guilt wash over me. I had been so busy managing the daily operations of the corporate empire, so busy grieving in a dark, empty house, that I had let a wolf walk right through the front door and put a diamond ring on my daughter's finger. Preston Sterling was exactly the kind of monster Sarah had warned me about. He looked at Chloe's charitable foundation, an organization she ran to provide musical instruments to underfunded public schools, and he called it a little charity project. He saw her kindness as a weakness to be exploited. Every instinct in my body, every protective urge of a father screamed at me to march straight back into that ballroom. I wanted to kick the grand double doors open. I wanted to grab Preston by his tailored Italian silk lapels, drag him onto the polished dance floor, and demand he repeat his disgusting predatory scheme to the entire crowd. I wanted to physically beat the arrogance out of him until he confessed his crimes in front of his wealthy, snobbish friends. I wanted to show him exactly what a country radio hick could do when his family was threatened. But the cold, rational part of my brain, the part that had successfully negotiated ruthless corporate acquisitions and crushed rival syndicates for decades, forced me to stop and breathe. I realized with sickening clarity that a public confrontation right now would be a catastrophic mistake. Preston was not just a greedy thief looking for a quick payout. He was a master psychological manipulator. Over the last year, he had methodically isolated Chloe from her oldest friends. He had painted his family as American royalty, an untouchable dynasty of elite real estate moguls who operated on a higher plane of existence. He played the part of the sophisticated savior who was rescuing Chloe from her boring blue-collar roots. He ordered wine in flawless French just to make me look foolish at dinners. He bought her incredibly flashy gifts to mask his own emotional distance. If I ran into that country club shouting accusations with no tangible proof, Preston would simply deny everything. He would look at Chloe with fake, practiced sympathy and say her father was having a severe mental breakdown. He would claim I was just a bitter, uneducated old man who was irrationally jealous of their upper-class lifestyle. And Chloe, sweet, naive Chloe, who absolutely hated conflict and believed unconditionally in love, would side with him. She would think I was trying to ruin the happiest time of her life out of spite. Preston would use the dramatic altercation to drive a permanent, insurmountable wedge between us, effectively locking me out of her life just in time for the wedding. I would lose my daughter entirely, and she would walk directly into a financial slaughterhouse with a smile on her face. I could not fight him with shouting. I could not fight him with my fists or with raw emotion. He wanted me to act like the uncultured hick he believed me to be. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my caterer jacket and pulled out the small, professional-grade digital voice recorder I had hidden there. The tiny red recording light was still blinking steadily in the dark cab of the truck. I pressed the stop button and stared at the sleek, black device resting in my calloused palm. This was the fracture. This was the massive, irreparable crack in his perfect facade. The tears of frustration dried on my cheeks. The sorrow and the rising panic evaporated completely, leaving behind a cold, calculating resolve that I had not felt since the early cutthroat days of building my broadcasting business. Preston Sterling thought he had me completely figured out. He thought I was just an ignorant old man who would be easily confused by corporate restructuring shell companies and offshore accounts. He thought his polished vocabulary and expensive suits made him invincible. He was about to find out exactly how Caldwell syndication and sound was built. I was not going to throw a single punch. I was going to use my corporate authority, my vast financial resources, and the crushing, undeniable weight of the federal legal system to dismantle the Sterling family piece by piece. I wiped my face with the back of my hand. I would not let Chloe endure the humiliation of a messy public breakup based on my word alone. I needed to show her the truth so clearly, so undeniably, that the illusion of Preston Sterling would shatter forever. I needed to build a trap so intricate and legally binding that by the time Preston realized he was caught, his entire empire would already be burning to the ground. I would use their own boundless arrogance and desperate greed as the very weapons that destroyed them. I put the keys in the ignition. The old engine roared to life with a familiar, comforting rumble. I pulled out of the parking lot, leaving the glittering lights and the false smiles of the country club far behind me in the rearview mirror. The tears were gone. The mourning period was over. The hunt had officially begun. The skyline of the city blurred past my windshield as I drove away from the country club, navigating the empty midnight streets with the mechanical precision of a man operating on pure adrenaline. My destination was not the quiet suburban house I lived in, but the true beating heart of my life's work. Downtown, surrounded by towering glass skyscrapers and high-end corporate banks, sat the headquarters of Caldwell Syndication and Sound. From the outside, it was a modest, windowless brick and steel structure. It looked like an old warehouse or a forgotten storage facility that the modern world had simply built around. That was entirely by design. I had purchased the building 3 decades ago and retrofitted every square inch of it to my exact specifications. Inside it was a multi-million-dollar fortress of acoustic perfection. It was my sanctuary. I pulled my faded Ford truck into the underground security bay and swiped my encrypted access card at the private elevator. The heavy steel doors slid open with a soft, mechanical hum. As I rode up to the executive levels, I could feel the faint, comforting vibrations of the massive broadcasting servers thrumming through the floorboards. When I stepped out onto the 4th floor, the absolute silence of the main studio enveloped me. We had engineered these walls to isolate and absorb every microscopic sound wave. The walls were lined with custom geometric acoustic foam, and the massive mixing consoles glowed with thousands of tiny LED lights in the darkened control room. It was a place built for total auditory clarity. It was a place where the truth of a voice could never be hidden behind background noise or smooth deception. I walked straight to the primary mixing bay and pulled the small digital recorder from my pocket. It felt as heavy as a block of solid lead in my calloused palm. I needed a professional. I needed the best ear in the entire broadcasting business to rip away the ambient noise of that country club and expose the naked, undeniable truth underneath. I picked up the internal phone and dialed the basement engineering lab. David answered on the first ring. He was my chief audio technician, a brilliant young man who practically lived in the studio and treated me like a second father. I told him to come up to the executive suite immediately and to lock the heavy acoustic doors behind him. When David arrived, he looked deeply concerned by my grim expression and the discarded cheap caterer uniform I had thrown over a leather chair. I did not give him time to ask questions or express his worry. I told him we had a severe breach of corporate security. I explained that I had covertly recorded a conversation involving a hostile takeover of our private assets, and I needed the audio stripped, cleaned, and amplified to absolute perfection. I told him this was a Tier 1 confidentiality matter, a situation that required absolute discretion. David simply nodded, his professional instincts instantly overriding his personal curiosity. He took the small device from my hand and connected it directly to the main console. The massive flat-screen monitors on the wall flared to life, displaying the jagged, chaotic waveforms of the raw audio file. We sat side by side in the heavy leather producer chairs. David put on his studio headphones and routed the playback through the primary overhead speakers. When he hit the playback button, the quiet control room suddenly filled with the muffled, chaotic sounds of the country club. We could hear the faint thumping of the jazz band, the sharp clinking of crystal glasses, and the heavy footsteps of guests walking through the carpeted hallway. Hidden deep beneath all that auditory garbage were the faint, distorted voices of Preston and his father, Richard Sterling. David went to work with the skill and focus of a master surgeon. His fingers flew across the mixing board, adjusting digital equalizers, isolating specific frequencies, and dropping heavy acoustic filters over the raw file. He isolated the bass frequencies of the distant jazz band and muted them completely. He scrubbed away the high-pitched clinking of glasses and the ambient hum of the country club air conditioning system. He zeroed in on the exact vocal range of the two men speaking inside the private cigar lounge. Layer by layer, the background interference fell away. The jagged green lines on the monitors smoothed out, leaving only the distinct, isolated sound waves of their voices. It took him nearly an hour of painstaking digital scrubbing, but finally David leaned back in his chair and hit the master play button. The voices of Preston and Richard Sterling echoed through the immaculate acoustics of the studio as if they were standing right there in the room with us. Every single syllable, every intake of breath, every cruel and calculating laugh was crystalline and sharp. I sat perfectly still, my face locked into an emotionless mask, forcing myself to endure the sound of my future son-in-law plotting the total financial destruction of my daughter. I listened again to his repulsive plan to drain Chloe's trust fund wire the cash to offshore accounts and leave her drowning in his federal corporate debt. I watched David shift uncomfortably in his seat beside me. He knew Chloe well. He had known her since she was a little girl, running through these very hallways, bringing us coffee during late-night recording sessions. I could see the profound shock and absolute disgust washing over his face as he realized exactly what we were listening to, but he remained silent out of deep respect for my authority. But the recording did not end where I thought it had. Back at the country club, I had dropped the champagne glass and fled down the hall, assuming their conversation was over. But the highly sensitive digital recorder in my pocket had continued to capture their final words as Preston walked toward the heavy oak door to investigate the noise. David amplified the very end of the file. The sound of my dropping glass echoed sharply through the studio speakers, followed by Preston muttering a vile curse. Then his father spoke again, his voice tight with sudden, overwhelming anxiety. Richard warned his son that he needed to be incredibly careful, that he was playing a highly dangerous game with federal investigators already watching their firm. He told Preston that he could not afford to get distracted by outside entertainment right now, not when they were so close to the finish line. And then Preston delivered a sentence that shattered whatever tiny, fragile fragment of restraint I had left in my soul. Preston laughed a dark, arrogant sound that made my skin crawl. He told his father to relax and stop panicking like an old woman. He bragged that he had everything completely under control. He said he was just passing the time with his side piece to keep his sanity intact before he was permanently chained to my boring, painfully naive daughter. He mocked Chloe's innocence and her charitable heart. He joked that his mistress was the only reason he was surviving the agonizing, tedious wedding planning process. He stated clearly that as long as he kept slipping away to the downtown hotel on the weekends, he could easily fake his way through the vows and keep the pathetic girl completely blind to the truth. The breath physically left my lungs. My chest tightened so violently I thought my ribs might literally crack under the immense pressure. This was not just a calculated financial assassination. It was a complete, deliberate, and utterly monstrous degradation of my child's heart. He was actively having an affair, mocking her pure, unconditional love with some unnamed woman, using her as a temporary distraction while he meticulously planned to destroy her entire future. The sheer magnitude of his betrayal was absolutely staggering. He did not just view my sweet Chloe as a convenient bank account. He viewed her as an object of ridicule, a pathetic, useful idiot to be used and discarded the moment her funds cleared the bank. I felt a sickening wave of heat rise in the back of my neck. My jaw clenched so hard my teeth ground together. I had spent my entire life shielding Chloe from the ugly, cynical realities of the world. Her mother and I had raised her to believe in honesty and fierce loyalty and in the inherent goodness of people. Preston had taken that beautiful, trusting light and turned it into a punchline for a cruel, disgusting joke. The fury that boiled inside me was absolute. It was a cold, terrifying wrath that demanded total and complete ruin for the man who dared to speak about my daughter that way. I did not want to just stop the wedding. I wanted to burn his entire world to the ground and salt the earth so deeply that his family name would be erased from polite society forever. But beneath the blinding, white-hot anger, my business instincts remained razor-sharp. I forced myself to focus, ordering David to enhance the final few seconds of the recording. Before opening the lounge door, Preston had made one last comment to his father to reassure him about the money. He mentioned the specific destination for the stolen trust fund capital. He said the offshore accounts were already prepped, verified, and waiting under the umbrella of a corporate entity called Horizon Vanguard Holdings in the Cayman Islands. He bragged confidently that the shell company was completely bulletproof, insulated by thick layers of international privacy laws that no local authorities or angry father could ever pierce. Horizon Vanguard Holdings. The name burned itself into my memory like a physical brand. That was the keystone. That was the hidden foundation of their entire fraudulent scheme. If I could shatter that specific shell company, if I could link that offshore entity back to Preston's domestic real estate fraud, I could expose their entire criminal operation to the federal government. But piercing an offshore corporate veil was not a simple task for a civilian. I knew absolutely everything there was to know about broadcast syndication media markets and acoustic engineering, but international financial law and corporate espionage were entirely different battlefields. I told David to save the enhanced audio file to a highly secure encrypted offline drive and to completely wipe every single digital trace of it from the main studio servers. I warned him that if a single syllable of this recording leaked to the press or to Chloe before I was fully prepared, the resulting explosion would destroy innocent people and give Preston the chance to run. David solemnly swore absolute secrecy. He handed me the heavy encrypted flash drive, looking at me with eyes full of deep, unspoken sympathy and fierce loyalty. I sat alone in the studio for a long time after David had returned to the basement. The perfect silence of the room, usually so comforting and peaceful to me, now felt incredibly heavy and oppressive. I stared at the blank mixing monitors, rapidly calculating my next move. I had the raw, undeniable evidence of their malice, but raw audio evidence was not nearly enough to guarantee their absolute destruction. Preston was a slippery, highly connected real estate developer with judges and politicians attending his parties. If I went to the police with an illegally obtained audio recording, his high-priced corporate defense lawyers would have it thrown out of court in a heartbeat. They would bury me in endless litigation, claim the audio was maliciously doctored, and rush the wedding forward before I could legally stop them. I needed a weapon that was completely legal, absolutely lethal, and totally invisible until the exact moment it struck his chest. I needed to dissect Horizon Vanguard Holdings and expose the rotten, bankrupt core of the Sterling family wealth without giving Preston the slightest hint that he was being hunted. I realized then that my money, my influence, and my covert recordings were only the very first step in a much larger war. To execute this properly, to ensure that Preston Sterling and his arrogant father spent the rest of their miserable lives rotting in a federal penitentiary, I needed a specialized tool. I needed a legal scalpel. I needed someone who operated comfortably in the dark, someone who deeply understood the ruthless, cutthroat world of corporate sabotage and asset seizure. I needed a man who hated predators even more than I did, and I knew exactly who to call. I did not sleep a single wink that night. I sat alone in the darkness of my kitchen, a cold cup of black coffee resting in my hands, watching the pale morning sun slowly rise over the city skyline. The heavy silence of the early hours offered absolutely no comfort to my racing mind. Every time I closed my exhausted eyes, I could perfectly hear Preston mocking my daughter. I could hear his arrogant, cruel laughter echoing off the walls of that cigar lounge. By 7 o'clock in the morning, the shock had completely burned away, leaving behind a cold, forged steel determination. I knew exactly what I had to do, and I knew exactly who I needed standing by my side to do it. I picked up my cell phone and dialed a number I kept strictly for absolute emergencies. The man on the other end of the line was Mitchell Reynolds. Mitchell was my late wife's older brother. To the rest of the corporate world, Mitchell was a terrifying force of nature. He was a senior managing partner at one of the most ruthless, highly respected corporate litigation firms on the East Coast. Men in $3,000 suits sweated profusely when Mitchell walked into a boardroom. He was a legal predator who dismantled rival corporations for sport. But to my daughter Chloe, he was simply Uncle Mitch, the gentle giant who used to let her ride on his shoulders at family barbecues and sneak her extra slices of peach cobbler when her mother was not looking. Mitchell loved Chloe as if she were his own flesh and blood. When my wife Sarah passed away, Mitchell and I stood together at her grave, and we made a silent pact to always protect the family she left behind. Mitchell operated with absolute discretion and lethal precision. If I needed a legal scalpel to dissect the Sterling family, Mitchell was a surgical guillotine. He answered the phone on the second ring. I did not waste any time with pleasantries or small talk. I kept my voice perfectly flat and told him I needed to see him immediately in person at my private recording studio downtown. I told him it concerned Chloe and that it was a matter of total financial survival. The line went dead silent for a fraction of a second. Mitchell did not ask a single question. He simply told me he would be there in 20 minutes and hung up. When Mitchell arrived, he walked through the heavy acoustic doors of the executive suite, wearing a sharp-tailored navy suit carrying a battered leather briefcase. His face was like carved granite. He took one look at my grim, exhausted expression and bypassed the usual morning greetings entirely. He set his briefcase on the floor, sat down in the heavy leather producer chair opposite the mixing board, steepled his fingers, and told me to speak. I did not try to soften the blow. I handed him the encrypted flash drive that my audio engineer had prepared the night before. I gave him a brief clinical summary of my undercover operation at the country club. I detailed my disguise, the cigar lounge, the overheard conversation, the offshore shell company, and the disgusting, vile way Preston had spoken about his niece. Mitchell did not say a single word while I spoke. His facial expression remained completely impassive, a blank wall of professional neutrality. But having known the man for nearly 40 years, I could see the cold, calculating fury igniting deep behind his eyes. He plugged the encrypted drive into his secured laptop and put on the high-fidelity studio headphones. I sat in silence, and watched my brother-in-law listen to the very same audio that had completely shattered my world hours earlier. I watched his jaw muscles tense. I saw his knuckles turn stark white as his large hands gripped the edge of the mixing console. The veins in his neck pulsed with a restrained, violent energy. When the digital recording finally finished, Mitchell slowly removed the headphones and placed them gently on the desk. The quiet control room felt incredibly heavy, thick with the unspoken promise of absolute retribution. He looked at me, and his voice was dead calm, dropping an octave lower than usual. He said the Sterling family had just made a fatal, catastrophic miscalculation. They assumed we were soft, naive country folk simply because we did not flash our wealth in high society magazines. Mitchell opened his leather briefcase and pulled out a fresh legal pad. He told me he was going to deploy his firm's top forensic accountants immediately. He kept a private team of former federal financial investigators on retainer who specialized in dismantling offshore corporate veils and tracing hidden assets. We were going to run a total unsparing financial autopsy on the entire Sterling real estate empire. For the next 72 hours, my flagship recording studio was completely transformed into a corporate war room. Mitchell and his elite team worked around the clock, fueled by black coffee and righteous anger. They operated completely under the radar, utilizing legal back channels and confidential industry contacts to pull the Sterling family apart piece by piece. They traced digital paper trails, requested sealed banking records, and pulled commercial property deeds from half a dozen different states. I sat in the corner of the room, reviewing the printed documents they handed me, feeling a growing sense of absolute, profound disgust. To the public eye, the Sterling family projected an image of untouchable American royalty. They drove imported luxury cars, hosted lavish charity galas at the country club, and constantly bragged about their massive commercial real estate acquisitions in major cities. They carried themselves with the loud, abrasive arrogance of people who believed they owned the world. But as Mitchell's forensic accountants ruthlessly peeled back the complicated layers of their corporate structure, the horrific, naked truth came into blinding focus. The Sterlings were not wealthy. They were completely spectacularly bankrupt. Their entire corporate empire was nothing but a fragile facade, a desperate house of cards built on a massive, crumbling mountain of leveraged debt. Mitchell laid a thick stack of highlighted financial summaries on the table in front of me. He pointed a heavy gold pen to a complex, tangled web of domestic shell companies, all cleverly designed to funnel money back to that single offshore entity Preston had mentioned in the audio recording. Horizon Vanguard Holdings. Mitchell explained the fraud in brutal, simple terms. Preston and his father Richard had been running a highly sophisticated Ponzi-style real estate scam for the past 5 years. They would collect massive amounts of capital from wealthy private investors, promising to fund lucrative new commercial developments and luxury residential towers. But instead of actually breaking ground on those new projects, they illegally diverted the fresh cash to pay the staggering compounding interest on their older failing bank loans. They were essentially moving stolen cash from one empty shell company to another, desperately trying to plug leaks in a sinking ship to keep the massive illusion afloat. They own absolutely nothing, Mitchell told me, his voice laced with venomous disgust. Every single commercial property they claim to hold is leveraged to the absolute legal limit. They are drowning in toxic secondary mortgages and unpayable environmental liens. Their corporate credit is completely maxed out, and their personal assets have been secretly borrowed against 3 times over. They are living entirely off the last remaining drops of stolen investor capital, and that well has finally run completely dry. The sheer scale of their deception was breathtaking. Preston was not just a greedy, arrogant opportunist looking to upgrade his lifestyle. He was a desperate, cornered animal fighting for his actual freedom. But the most terrifying revelation was yet to come. Mitchell reached back into his briefcase and pulled out a single highly confidential red folder. He had used a very quiet, trusted contact within the Federal Department of Justice to pull an inquiry on Preston Sterling's firm. Mitchell looked me dead in the eye and delivered the final crushing blow. He told me Preston was currently facing an imminent, massive federal indictment. The Securities and Exchange Commission had finally caught wind of the missing investor funds. They had quietly opened a sweeping federal investigation into severe wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and massive fiduciary breach. The federal authorities were currently preparing to execute a comprehensive unannounced audit of the Sterling family's entire corporate portfolio. I stared at the dates printed on the legal documents in the red folder, and suddenly the entire horrifying puzzle snapped into perfect, terrifying clarity. My breath caught in my throat as the sheer calculated evil of Preston's plan finally made total sense. The wedding was scheduled for the second Saturday in October. According to the federal subpoena, Mitchell had intercepted Preston's mandatory corporate audits were legally scheduled to begin exactly 1 week later. 7 days. Preston had rushed the engagement. He had heavily pressured Chloe into a short, frantic wedding planning period, claiming he was simply so deeply in love that he could not bear to wait another moment to start their life together. It was a complete, calculated lie. He was not rushing toward a life of marital bliss. He was racing against a ticking federal clock. Chloe's trust fund, which I had set up years ago to ensure her lifelong security, was the exact amount needed to plug the massive gaping hole in his corporate accounts. The instant they were legally married, Preston would gain access to her assets under the guise of joint marital investments. He planned to drain her accounts entirely, wire the money directly to Horizon Vanguard Holdings in the Cayman Islands, and use her clean, untraceable capital to secretly pay back the stolen investor funds before the federal auditors knocked on his office door. He was going to use my daughter's inheritance to buy his own freedom, erase his criminal liability, and then abandon her, leaving her legally bound to the remaining millions of dollars in toxic corporate debt. If we did not stop this, my daughter would not just be heartbroken by a failed marriage, she would be utterly financially destroyed. She would be hopelessly tied to a federal criminal investigation, interrogated by government agents, and dragged through years of humiliating, soul-crushing litigation. Preston was willing to destroy a kind, innocent young woman just to save his own miserable skin. I felt a cold, prickling sweat break out across my shoulders. The margin for error was completely non-existent. If we moved too soon, if we showed our hand or tipped Preston off in any way, he would realize we were actively hunting him. He would panic, hide the remaining offshore assets, destroy the physical evidence of his fraud, and likely flee the country before the federal authorities could freeze his passports. If we waited too long, he would marry my daughter, steal everything she had ever owned, and vanish into the wind. Mitchell packed his dense stacks of financial documents back into his leather briefcase and snapped the brass locks shut. The sharp metallic sound echoed loudly in the silent recording studio. He looked across the table at me, his face hardened into an immovable mask of pure, absolute resolve. He asked me exactly how I wanted to proceed, reminding me that we held the power of life and death over the Sterling family in these files. I stood up slowly from the leather chair, feeling the weight of my years, but also feeling an incredible surging strength. I thought of Sarah, of her gentle smile, and the fierce, protective way she loved our daughter. I thought of Preston standing in that smoke-filled room, arrogantly mocking the girl who loved him unconditionally. I told Mitchell we were not going to stop the wedding preparations. We were going to let Preston believe his master plan was working flawlessly. We were going to smile at their dinner parties, shake their hands, and play the role of the happy, oblivious country family perfectly. But behind the scenes, operating entirely in the shadows, we were going to build a legal and financial trap so tight, so completely inescapable that Preston Sterling would not even realize he was caught until the prison doors were already slamming shut behind him. We were going to dismantle his fake empire, strip him of his stolen assets, and feed him directly to the federal authorities on a silver platter. The invisible waiter had heard enough. It was time to serve the main course. The smell of burnt coffee and frying bacon hung thick in the air of the Silver Spoon Diner. It was a small working-class establishment located right on the edge of the industrial district, miles away from the polished glass skyscrapers and velvet-lined country clubs that Preston Sterling usually frequented. I chose this specific location for a very deliberate reason. I wanted him entirely out of his element. I wanted him to feel vastly superior to his surroundings, and by extension vastly superior to me. Arrogance is a predator's greatest weakness. When a man believes he is the smartest person in the room, he completely stops checking his blind spots. I sat in a cracked vinyl booth near the back, wearing a faded denim jacket, scuffed work boots, and a plain cotton shirt. To anyone walking through those glass doors, I looked exactly like an aging, tired radio technician who had spent 40 years twisting knobs and fixing broken broadcast antennas. That was exactly the illusion I needed to project. I nursed a mug of bitter black coffee and watched the rain streak against the diner window. In my inner breast pocket rested a thick envelope containing a legal document drafted by my brother-in-law, Mitchell. It was a masterpiece of corporate sabotage disguised as a generous fatherly gift. Through the rain-slicked window, I finally saw Preston pull into the gravel parking lot. He parked his gleaming imported sports car diagonally across 2 spaces, stepping out into the drizzle, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than the entire kitchen staff earned in a month. He looked around the run-down parking lot with undisguised disgust before pulling open the diner door. He scanned the room, his eyes lingering with contempt on the tired truck drivers and weary factory workers eating their morning meals before he finally spotted me in the back corner. He pasted on a bright, utterly manufactured smile and strode over to my booth. Harrison, he greeted me smoothly, sliding into the vinyl seat opposite mine. He made a grand show of brushing an invisible speck of dust from his expensive lapel. I have to admit, this part of town is a little off the beaten path for me. When you said you wanted to grab a quick lunch man to man, I assumed we would be meeting downtown near the financial center. I offered him a warm, slightly sheepish smile, playing the role of the simple country father to absolute perfection. I know it is not fancy, Preston, but they make the best cherry pie in the county right here. Plus the waitresses know me. I'm just a simple guy. Those high-end downtown restaurants with the fancy menus always make my head spin. I never know which fork to use. Preston let out a soft, patronizing chuckle. He looked at me with eyes that held absolutely zero respect. It is perfectly fine, Harrison. We all have our comfort zones. I just squeezed this meeting in between 2 major corporate calls, so I only have a little bit of time. What did you want to discuss? Is Chloe doing all right with all the wedding planning? I leaned forward and rested my calloused hands on the sticky Formica table. I let out a heavy sigh, expertly faking the demeanor of a worried, overwhelmed older man who was completely out of his depth. Chloe is wonderful, I told him, keeping my voice gentle and slightly unsteady. She is so incredibly excited to marry you. But I have to be honest, Preston. All this talk about high society weddings, trust funds, and big city real estate is starting to make me dizzy. Her mother and I started out with absolutely nothing but a single radio tower and a mountain of debt. I know how to fix a broken microphone and balance a broadcast schedule, but I do not understand all this modern financial stuff. Preston leaned back in his booth, crossing his arms with a smug, self-satisfied posture. He was practically glowing with arrogant superiority. You do not need to worry about a thing, Harrison. I handle complex corporate structures every single day. My family has been managing vast estates for generations. I promise you Chloe is in the absolute best hands. I will manage all the complicated financial burdens so she never has to stress over them." I nodded slowly, looking down at my coffee mug as if I were deeply relieved by his empty promises. "That brings me to why I asked you here today," I said, looking back up into his cold, calculating eyes. "I know you are a big-time real estate developer. You know how to turn dirt into gold. And I want to do something special for you and Chloe before the wedding. Something to help you two build your future." Preston raised a perfectly groomed eyebrow. His posture shifted instantly. The moment he smelled money, his predatory instincts flared to life. "What kind of something are we talking about, Harrison?" I reached into my denim jacket and pulled out the thick legal envelope. I placed it on the table between us. Years ago, before Sarah passed away, we bought a massive parcel of commercial riverfront property on the south side of the city. We originally thought we might build a new broadcasting and syndication headquarters out there. But times changed. We found a better building downtown, and that riverfront land has just been sitting completely empty for over a decade. It is a huge piece of acreage prime for commercial development. Preston stared at the envelope, his eyes widening marginally. The South Side riverfront was highly coveted real estate. He knew exactly how much raw acreage in that sector was worth to a commercial developer. A hungry, desperate light illuminated his face. I pushed the envelope slightly closer to him. "I'm an old radio guy, Preston. I do not know the first thing about commercial zoning or building permits. I tried reading through the property taxes and the limited liability thingamajig, but it just gives me a headache. I want to transfer the deed entirely to you. I want you to take the property, put it solely in your name, and develop it. Consider it an early wedding gift from a father who just wants to see his daughter secure." Preston reached out and touched the envelope. His greed was so absolute, so overwhelmingly blinding, that he did not even pause to question why a man would simply hand over prime real estate in a dirty diner. He saw a gullible, uneducated hick who was freely surrendering a multi-million-dollar asset. "That is incredibly generous of you, Harrison," Preston said, his voice dripping with fake humility. "I am genuinely touched. I can absolutely take that burden off your hands. My firm can develop that land and turn it into a spectacular portfolio piece for our future family." He opened the envelope and pulled out the thick stack of legal documents Mitchell had prepared. What Preston did not know was the horrifying, toxic truth hiding beneath the surface of that property. The land I was gifting him was an abandoned industrial manufacturing plant I had acquired in a corporate buyout 20 years ago. It was secretly burdened with decades of severe, catastrophic environmental contamination. The soil was saturated with toxic chemical runoff from the previous owners. The Environmental Protection Agency had recently issued a massive, non-negotiable federal mandate requiring a total ecological cleanup. The financial liability attached to that specific parcel of land was a staggering black hole. The mandated federal cleanup alone would cost upwards of $10 million, not including the astronomical daily fines the government would levy against the registered owner. Mitchell and I had legally structured the deed transfer using incredibly dense, antiquated corporate jargon. Buried deep within the 50 pages of standard property transfer clauses was an assumption of absolute liability. Mitchell had brilliantly woven a cross-collateralization clause into the fine print. By signing the transfer and accepting the deed, the new owner legally agreed to assume total personal responsibility for the environmental liens. The document explicitly stated that if the new owner failed to produce the capital for the immediate federal cleanup, the government had the legal right to instantly seize and liquidate all of their remaining personal assets, corporate shell companies, and private bank accounts to cover the debt. I was not handing Preston a wedding gift. I was handing him a ticking financial time bomb wrapped in a bow. Preston flipped through the first few pages of the document, his eyes scanning the standard property descriptions and the boundary lines. He did not read the fine print. He did not look at the liability clauses buried on page 42. He was entirely consumed by the blinding rush of his own greed. He believed he had just manipulated a foolish old man into surrendering a fortune. "You know, Preston," I said, maintaining my gentle, clueless tone. "My lawyer mentioned something about you needing your own attorneys to look over the paperwork first. He said it was standard procedure. We can put a pin in this and let the legal team sort it out over the next few weeks if you prefer." I knew exactly how to play him. By offering him the chance to delay, I triggered his frantic desperation. Preston was facing an imminent federal audit. His entire fraudulent empire was collapsing by the hour. He needed hard assets on his balance sheets immediately to pacify his desperate creditors. The absolute last thing he wanted was to wait weeks for a slow, methodical legal review that might uncover his own precarious financial ruin, or worse, give the old country hick time to change his mind. Preston offered a dismissive wave of his hand and pulled a heavy silver fountain pen from his suit pocket. "That will not be necessary at all, Harrison," he said smoothly, completely taking the bait. "I deal with standard commercial deed transfers every single day. Getting the corporate lawyers involved will just tie the property up in pointless red tape for months. It is much cleaner to just execute the transfer directly between us today. It saves us both a massive headache." "Are you absolutely sure?" I asked, letting a trace of hesitation enter my voice. "I just want to make sure I am doing right by you and Chloe." "I am absolutely certain," Preston insisted, flashing his brilliant, predatory smile. He flipped directly to the final signature page. Mitchell had placed the assumption of liability acknowledgement right above the signature line, hidden perfectly within a dense, impenetrable block of Latin legal phrasing. Preston did not even glance at it. He was too eager to secure his prize. He pressed his silver pen to the paper and quickly signed his full legal name in bold, sweeping strokes. He dated the document, initialed the margins, and pushed the stack of papers back across the diner table toward me. "There we go," Preston said, visibly relaxing as he capped his pen. "The property is officially under my corporate umbrella. I will have my team file the transfer with the county clerk this afternoon. You do not need to worry about a single thing, Harrison. I will take everything from here." I slowly pulled the signed documents back across the sticky table. I looked down at his bold signature. The ink was still gleaming wet under the fluorescent diner lights. A profound, icy wave of satisfaction washed over my entire body. The trap had sprung. The heavy steel doors had slammed completely shut. By legally accepting the deed, Preston had just irrevocably tied his entire remaining financial existence to a $10 million federal environmental lien. The moment he tried to leverage the property, the federal government would freeze his accounts and seize his assets to pay for the toxic cleanup. He had just signed his own financial death warrant, and he did it with a smile on his face. I carefully slid the documents back into the thick envelope and tucked it safely into the inner pocket of my faded denim jacket. "Thank you, Preston," I said, looking up at him. My voice was no longer trembling or unsure. It was steady, resonant, and cold. "You have absolutely no idea how much of a burden you just took off my shoulders." Preston checked his expensive wristwatch and slid out of the vinyl booth, completely oblivious to the subtle shift in my tone. "It was my pleasure, Harrison. Now, if you will excuse me, I have to get back downtown. These corporate acquisitions do not manage themselves. Tell Chloe I will see her at the bridal fitting tomorrow." I watched him walk out of the diner, pull his tailored suit jacket tight against the rain, and climb back into his flashy imported car. He sped out of the gravel parking lot, leaving a trail of exhaust in his wake. I sat alone in the quiet diner for a long time, sipping my bitter black coffee. The waitress walked over and asked if I needed anything else. I told her I had exactly what I needed. Preston Sterling thought he was the smartest predator in the city. He thought he had effortlessly robbed a naive old man blind. He had no idea that systemic karma had just wrapped its hands firmly around his throat. The countdown to his absolute destruction had officially begun. 3 days had passed since the meeting at the diner. 3 agonizing days of holding my breath and waiting to see if the bait had truly been taken. My brother-in-law Mitchell had deployed a team of elite private investigators to shadow Preston Sterling around the clock. We needed absolute confirmation that Preston filed the property transfer with the county clerk. If he hesitated, or if he showed those documents to an outside corporate attorney, the environmental liability trap would be exposed and our entire counterattack would crumble. I spent those 72 hours pacing the soundproof floors of my recording studio, drinking far too much black coffee, and watching the encrypted communication channels for any update from the surveillance team. On Thursday afternoon, Mitchell finally called. He confirmed that Preston, driven by his suffocating greed and the ticking clock of his federal indictments, had rushed the paperwork through the municipal courts. The poisoned deed was officially registered under his personal holding company. The trap was set armed and completely inescapable. I felt a brief wave of profound relief wash over my tired shoulders. The financial guillotine was hanging directly over his neck. Now I just needed to monitor his movements to make sure he did not flee the country before the wedding day. But the investigators had not just been tracking his real estate filings. They had been tracking every single step he took, mapping out his daily routines, his burner phones, and his weekend hotel reservations. They promised to deliver a comprehensive dossier on his private activities by Friday morning. The lead investigator was a former federal agent named Cole. He arrived at my studio on Friday, precisely at 9 o'clock in the morning. He carried a heavy manila envelope and wore an expression made of solid stone. He did not offer a polite smile or a standard greeting. He just walked into the control room, placed the envelope on the mahogany mixing console, and looked at me with eyes full of a grim, heavy pity. I had hired men like Cole before, during fierce corporate syndication battles. I knew that look. It was the look a man gave you right before he delivered news that would fundamentally shatter your reality. I poured him a cup of coffee, but he shook his head. He told me that they had successfully tracked Preston to a luxury boutique hotel on the north side of the city. They had secured covert video and audio surveillance of Preston meeting with the mistress he had bragged about in the cigar lounge. Cole warned me to brace myself. He said he had seen a lot of ugly things in his line of work, but the level of deception in this file was staggering. I assured Cole that I had already heard Preston confess to his financial crimes and his infidelity. I told him nothing could possibly shock me anymore. I genuinely believed I had already reached the absolute bottom of this nightmare. I was completely wrong. I opened the thick manila envelope and pulled out a stack of high-definition surveillance photographs. The first few images showed Preston parking his imported sports car in the underground garage of the hotel. The next few showed him entering a private penthouse suite. Then I turned to the photographs taken from a discreet angle across the street, peering through the expansive glass windows of the suite. I saw Preston pouring 2 glasses of wine. I saw a woman walk into the frame from the adjoining room. She was wearing a silk robe, tossing her blonde hair over her shoulder, smiling a bright, familiar smile as she took the glass from his hand. The air in the recording studio vanished instantly. My lungs seized, refusing to take in oxygen. My hands began to shake so violently that the glossy photographs slipped from my fingers and scattered across the digital mixing board. I stared at the face of the woman in the picture, my mind aggressively rejecting the information my eyes were processing. It was Amanda. Amanda was my late wife's niece. She was Chloe's cousin, but she was so much more than just a relative. When Amanda's parents went through a bitter, financially ruinous divorce 15 years ago, Sarah and I practically raised her. We paid for her private school tuition. We covered her college expenses. She spent every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, and every summer vacation sitting at our dinner table. Chloe and Amanda grew up sharing secrets, trading clothes, and dreaming about the future together like biological sisters. Sarah had personally taken Amanda shopping for her high school prom dress, crying tears of joy right alongside her. Chloe had always protected Amanda, fiercely defending her against childhood bullies and sharing every blessing our family had without a single ounce of jealousy. Chloe adored her with an innocent, absolute loyalty. Just 2 weeks ago, Chloe had asked Amanda to be her maid of honor. I had watched Amanda cry tears of joy, hug my daughter, and swear she would do everything to make the wedding the most magical day of Chloe's life. Now here she was, standing in a luxury hotel suite, wrapping her arms around the man who was actively plotting to destroy the cousin who loved her. The betrayal was so deep, so vicious, and so intimately cruel that it felt like a physical knife twisting slowly in my chest. I felt a sickening wave of nausea wash over me. This was not just a greedy outsider trying to rob us. The poison was inside our own house. It was sitting at our family dinner table. It was trying on bridesmaid dresses and smiling in our family photographs. Cole quietly stepped forward and inserted a secure digital drive into the studio monitor system. He told me the visual evidence was only half the story. The investigative team had managed to clone the audio feed from a smart device inside the hotel suite. He clicked a button, and the massive screens in the control room flickered to life, showing the covert video footage perfectly synced with crisp, clear audio. I stood frozen, watching the two of them lounge on a velvet sofa, clinking their wine glasses together in a mocking toast. I listened to Amanda's voice, the same voice that had cheerfully called me Uncle Harrison for 2 decades, as she casually discussed the destruction of my daughter. She asked Preston if the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands were fully operational. Preston smirked, kissing her shoulder, and assured her that Horizon Vanguard Holdings was primed and ready to receive the wire transfers the moment the wedding concluded. Amanda laughed, a sharp, greedy sound that made my skin crawl with revulsion. She took a sip of her wine and shook her head. She said Chloe was so pathetically naive that she would probably sign the joint account authorizations without even reading them. Amanda mocked Chloe's dedication to her charity work, calling her a spoiled little princess playing saint with daddy's money. She even laughed about the wedding dress Chloe had chosen, calling it an expensive rag that would look perfect in a divorce proceeding. Preston joined in, joking that they were actually doing Chloe a favor by introducing her to the real world. He bragged about the diner meeting, telling Amanda how easily he had manipulated the foolish old man into surrendering a massive commercial property. He laughed at my worn denim jacket and my supposed ignorance of real estate law, completely unaware that the very property he was celebrating was a toxic anchor currently chained to his own ankles. Then Amanda outlined her exact cut of the stolen trust fund. She demanded a full 30% of the initial wire transfer to keep her mouth shut and play the supportive cousin during the inevitable divorce fallout. Preston agreed without hesitation, promising her that once the federal auditors were off his back and the legal dust settled, they could finally be together permanently on a beach in the Caribbean, completely funded by my daughter's stolen inheritance. They literally clinked their glasses to the future, laughing at how easily they had fooled the entire Caldwell family. I watched Amanda lean in and kiss the man who was plotting to ruin her own blood relative. The sheer, unadulterated evil radiating from those screens was paralyzing. I had spent 40 years navigating the cutthroat corporate broadcasting industry. I had dealt with ruthless executives, dishonest competitors, and aggressive hostile takeovers. But I had never in my entire 68 years on this earth witnessed a level of human depravity so profound and so intimately destructive. The video ended, and the screens faded to a dark, quiet gray. The silence in the control room was heavy and suffocating. A massive roaring fire, ignited deep within my soul. The primal urge to enact immediate physical violence was so intense, it actually blurred my vision. I wanted to drive straight to that hotel, kick the penthouse door completely off its hinges, and drag Preston Sterling out into the street by his throat. I wanted to stand in front of Amanda, look her dead in the eye, and demand to know how she could sell her soul and betray the family that had fed her, clothed her, and loved her unconditionally. I wanted to burn their world down right there in the middle of the afternoon. My fists were clenched so tightly that my fingernails cut deep, bloody half-moons into the palms of my hands. Cole stepped back, clearly recognizing the dangerous explosive energy radiating from me. He quietly asked if I wanted him to call Mitchell, or if I wanted to involve local law enforcement to press immediate extortion charges. I closed my eyes and took a long, shuddering breath. I thought about Sarah. I thought about the promise I made to her to protect Chloe at all costs. If I acted on this blinding rage, if I stormed the hotel or confronted Amanda right now, the entire carefully constructed legal trap would instantly evaporate. Preston would realize he was exposed, he would alert his corporate defense lawyers, and he would scramble his offshore assets before the federal authorities could finalize their indictments. Amanda would play the victim spin a web of lies to confuse Chloe and potentially turn my own daughter against me by claiming I had illegally spied on them out of a paranoid obsession. I could not afford a single mistake. I could not let my anger rob my daughter of absolute permanent justice. I forced my muscles to unclench. I opened my eyes and looked at the blank black screens. I told Cole to continue the surveillance to document every single interaction and to prepare the entire multimedia package for professional broadcast. The rehearsal dinner was just weeks away. I was going to let Amanda stand right next to my daughter, wearing the expensive dress my family had paid for. I was going to let Preston raise his glass in front of all his elite snobbish friends. I was going to let them climb to the absolute highest peak of their arrogant confidence, and then when they had nowhere left to run, I was going to pull the lever and let the devastating, inescapable weight of systemic karma deliver a blow far worse than any physical violence I could ever inflict. The legal trap was locked, the ultimate betrayal was documented, and the final curtain was about to fall. The crystal chandeliers of the Rosewood Estate Country Club cast a warm golden glow over 75 of the most pretentious people I had ever been forced to share a room with. It was the evening of the rehearsal dinner, exactly 24 hours before my daughter was supposed to sign her life away. The Sterling family had spared absolutely no expense for this preliminary celebration, primarily because they were quietly expecting my daughter's newly unlocked trust fund to cover the massive catering bill by the end of the week. Waiters in pristine white jackets circled the grand ballroom, balancing silver trays loaded with imported caviar, seared scallops, and ridiculously expensive vintage champagne. The floral arrangements on each table were towering structures of white orchids and imported roses that completely blocked the view of the people sitting across from you. It was a suffocating display of manufactured wealth designed specifically to intimidate and overwhelm. I sat at the head table in a dark, conservative suit, maintaining a perfectly pleasant smile, while a storm of absolute righteous fury churned violently inside my chest. The guests filling the room were a collection of local politicians, aggressive commercial real estate developers, and corporate defense lawyers. They looked at me with thin, polite smiles that barely masked their utter disdain. To them, I was just the quaint father of the bride, the simple, rural radio man who had somehow managed to scrape together a decent living. They traded stories about European vacations and luxury yacht purchases, completely unaware that the very foundation of the Sterling Empire they so deeply admired was currently disintegrating under the weight of federal investigations and my own meticulously laid traps. They thought they were the smartest people in the room. They had no idea they were sitting in the middle of a blast zone. My gaze drifted to the center of the room. Chloe looked absolutely radiant. She wore a simple, elegant silk dress that highlighted the genuine, innocent joy radiating from her entire being. Her eyes were bright, and her sweet laughter floated over the heavy, arrogant hum of the wealthy crowd. She was completely oblivious to the catastrophic betrayal standing right next to her. Amanda, her own cousin, and chosen maid of honor, hovered constantly at Chloe's side. Amanda played the role of the devoted best friend with a sickening level of perfection. She smoothed the fabric of Chloe's dress, fetched her fresh glasses of sparkling water, and wiped away fake tears of joy whenever anyone offered the bride a compliment. Knowing what I knew, watching Amanda smile at my daughter was an exercise in pure psychological torture. I had to force my hands to remain resting calmly on the white tablecloth to prevent myself from reaching across the floral centerpieces and dragging that treacherous woman out of the building. I thought about the thousands of meals I had provided for Amanda, the college tuition I had paid when her own parents failed her financially, and the profound, unconditional love my daughter had showered upon her for 2 decades. The absolute sheer depravity of her betrayal turned my stomach into a knot of cold iron. I took a slow sip of my ice water, reminding myself that systemic karma required patience. A sharp clinking sound pulled my attention to the front of the room. Preston Sterling stood at the head of the main table, tapping a silver spoon against his crystal champagne flute to command the attention of the crowded ballroom. The room gradually fell into a respectful, expectant silence. Preston looked like he had just stepped out of a high-end fashion magazine. His hair was perfectly styled, and his tailored tuxedo fit his broad shoulders flawlessly. He flashed that brilliant predatory smile that had fooled my daughter and completely charmed her friends. He raised his glass high in the air, his eyes sweeping over the attentive audience with practiced grace. Family and friends. Preston began, his voice projecting with smooth, confident warmth over the sound system. We are gathered here tonight on the eve of the most important day of my entire life. Tomorrow, I get to marry my absolute best friend, my soulmate, and the most beautiful woman I have ever known. He turned to look down at Chloe, his eyes softening into a mask of pure manufactured devotion. Chloe blushed deeply, looking up at him with a heart full of absolute trust and adoration. In the fast-paced world of commercial real estate, Preston continued placing a hand over his heart. It is so easy to lose sight of what truly matters. We spend our days chasing massive contracts and building skyscrapers. But Chloe has taught me that the greatest foundation a man can ever build is one rooted in family, in honesty, and in unshakable loyalty. A collective murmur of approval swept through the wealthy crowd. Several older women dabbed their eyes with expensive linen napkins. Amanda stood right behind Chloe, smiling widely and clapping her hands with enthusiastic support. The sheer hypocrisy of the moment was almost physically blinding. This man who was actively plotting to funnel my daughter's inheritance into a Cayman Islands shell company, who was planning to abandon her with millions in federal debt, was currently lecturing a room full of people about honesty and loyalty. Preston turned his gaze toward me, raising his glass in my direction. I want to take a special moment to thank Harrison Caldwell, Preston said, his voice dripping with condescending warmth. Harrison, you have raised an incredible daughter. I know it is never easy for a father to hand over his little girl, but I promise you in front of all our loved ones that I will spend every single day of my life protecting her, providing for her, and keeping her safe from the harsh realities of the world. To Chloe, and to the unbreakable bond of family. The crowd erupted into loud, enthusiastic applause. Glasses clinked together in a chorus of celebration. Chloe wiped a tear from her cheek, and stood up to wrap her arms tightly around Preston's neck. I watched them embrace, feeling the heavy, undeniable weight of the moment settling squarely onto my shoulders. It was time. The illusion had reached its absolute peak, and it was time to bring the entire artificial structure crashing down to the polished hardwood floor. The master of ceremonies stepped to the microphone and announced that the father of the bride had prepared a special audiovisual presentation to honor the happy couple. The lights in the grand ballroom began to dim slowly, casting the room in a soft, theatrical shadow. A massive high-definition projection screen descended silently from the ceiling directly behind the head table. I stood up from my chair and slowly buttoned my dark suit jacket. I walked toward the front of the room with the measured, deliberate pace of a man walking to an execution. Preston had naturally assumed I was technologically inept. He thought I was just a rural radio hick who barely knew how to operate a modern cellular phone. He had happily agreed when I offered to handle the audio-visual setup for the rehearsal dinner, probably assuming I would just hire a cheap local vendor to play a boring slideshow of baby pictures, accompanied by a soft, sentimental country song. He had absolutely no idea that the two unassuming men in black polo shirts standing at the soundboard in the back of the room were not basic event staff. They were David and Thomas, the senior acoustic engineers from my flagship downtown recording studio. I had deployed my own elite corporate technicians to wire the country club ballroom with state-of-the-art high-fidelity concert speakers and a cinema-grade digital projector. The sound system in this room was currently powerful enough to broadcast a live symphony with crystal-clear perfection. I stepped up to the podium and grasped the edges of the wooden stand. I looked out over the sea of expectant faces. The room was completely silent. Chloe looked up at me with a bright, encouraging smile, eagerly waiting to see the embarrassing childhood photographs I had warned her about. Preston stood beside her with his hands casually tucked into his pockets, projecting an aura of bored, polite tolerance. Amanda was leaning against the table, completely relaxed and confident in her deception. "Preston," I started speaking directly into the microphone. My voice boomed through the massive speakers, carrying a heavy, resonant clarity that commanded absolute attention. "You spoke very beautifully just now about honesty. You spoke about the unbreakable bond of family and the importance of protecting the people you claim to love. As a father, there is nothing more important to me than knowing exactly what kind of man is taking my daughter's hand. I have always believed that you cannot truly know a person based on what they say when everyone is watching. You only discover a man's true character by listening to what he says when he believes he is completely alone." Preston's arrogant smile faltered for a fraction of a second. A tiny flicker of confusion crossed his polished features. Richard Sterling, sitting at the adjacent table, suddenly sat up very straight, his eyes narrowing as he sensed a sudden shift in my tone. I did not look away from Preston, as I gave a subtle, almost imperceptible nod to David at the back of the room. I told my daughter I had put together a presentation to showcase the absolute truth of your relationship. I continued, my voice cold and hard as forged steel. And I meant it. I stepped back from the podium. The massive screen behind me flared with a bright, blinding white light, but there were no baby pictures. There was no soft, sentimental music. Instead, the pristine, digitally enhanced audio of Preston's own voice exploded through the concert-grade speakers, echoing off the walls of the grand ballroom with terrifying, inescapable volume. As soon as the ink dries on the marriage certificate, I am funneling her entire trust fund directly into our Cayman shell accounts to cover the massive deficits. The sound of Preston's cruel, mocking laughter filled the room. The audio was so perfectly isolated and amplified by my engineers that every single guest could hear the sneering, predatory contempt in his tone. I will string the girl along for a few months just to make the marriage look legitimate to the authorities. And then I will file for a sudden divorce. I will leave the girl entirely burdened with the remaining corporate debt, and we walk away completely clean. A collective gasp of absolute horror ripped through the ballroom. The wealthy, sophisticated crowd froze in a state of sheer, unadulterated shock. The color instantly drained from Preston's face, leaving him looking like a pale, terrified ghost. He stumbled backward, bumping hard into the head table, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly as his own voice continued to damn him over the massive speakers. Richard Sterling knocked his chair over in a frantic panic, staring up at the sound system, as if it were raining fire down upon him. I looked at my daughter. Chloe was standing perfectly still, her hands hovering near her mouth. Her eyes were wide with a devastating mixture of confusion and sudden shattering heartbreak. She looked at Preston silently, begging him to explain, to tell her this was some kind of terrible, impossible mistake. But the presentation was far from over. The audio seamlessly transitioned to the second recording, the one captured from the covert hotel surveillance. The voice of Amanda, crisp and undeniable, rang out across the silent, horrified crowd. Chloe is so pathetically naive that she would probably sign the joint account authorizations without even reading them. As Amanda's treacherous voice echoed through the room, the blank white projection screen suddenly changed. A massive high-definition, full-color photograph appeared. It was crystal clear, capturing Preston and Amanda walking into the luxury hotel suite, locked in a passionate, undeniably romantic embrace. The image shifted to another photograph showing the two of them sitting on the velvet sofa, clinking their wine glasses together in a mocking toast, celebrating the successful manipulation of my innocent daughter. Amanda let out a piercing, terrified shriek. She backed away from Chloe, holding her hands up in front of her face, as the guests around her began to loudly murmur in disgust. Chloe turned her head slowly, looking at her cousin, the woman she had loved like a sister, and the absolute devastation on my daughter's face nearly broke my heart in two. I hated causing her this profound pain, but I knew that excising a tumor always requires a brutal, painful cut. The illusion was completely shattered. The predators were exposed in front of their entire high society circle, and the trap had finally snapped fully shut. The silence that followed the final photograph was not peaceful. It was a pressurized vacuum right before a massive explosion. For a split second, 75 of the city's most affluent citizens stopped breathing completely. Then the absolute chaos broke loose. The fragile crystal champagne flute slipped from Chloe's trembling fingers. It hit the polished hardwood floor, shattering into hundreds of tiny, glittering pieces. That sharp noise seemed to break the spell holding the room hostage. A low collective murmur of shock rippled through the elegant tables, quickly rising into a deafening roar of disbelief and outrage. Women in designer gowns covered their mouths, backing away from the head table, as if Preston and Amanda had suddenly contracted a lethal disease. Men in tailored suits stood up, pointing fingers and shouting over the growing commotion. I kept my eyes locked entirely on my daughter. Chloe looked absolutely paralyzed. Her bright, beautiful smile had collapsed into a mask of pure devastation. She stared at Amanda, her own cousin, her chosen maid of honor, who was now backed against the floral centerpieces, weeping uncontrollably and violently, shaking her head. Chloe did not scream. She did not yell. The betrayal was so profoundly deep that it simply robbed her of her voice. Preston, however, found his voice quickly. Panic and sheer desperation turned his handsome features into an ugly, snarling mask. He lunged toward the microphone I had left at the podium, nearly tripping over the long tablecloth. "It is a lie," he bellowed into the microphone, his voice cracking with frantic energy. He pointed a shaking finger directly at me. "Look at him. Look at this crazy old man. He hates me. He has always hated my family. He hired some cheap audio technicians to fabricate this garbage. It is a deep fake. It is all digitally altered. None of that was real. You all know me. You know my father. You know the Sterling name. Are you really going to believe a bitter, uneducated radio mechanic over us?" He was sweating profusely, the expensive fabric of his tuxedo shirt clinging to his chest. He turned to Chloe, reaching out with both hands, trying to summon that manufactured charm he had used for the past year. "Chloe, baby, you have to listen to me," he pleaded, his voice dripping with desperate manipulation. "Your father is losing his mind. He is obsessed with ruining our happiness. He wants to keep you locked away in his miserable little world forever. You know I love you. You know Amanda is just your cousin. This is a pathetic smear campaign." But Chloe did not take a single step toward him. She looked at his outstretched hands, then up at the massive projection screen that was still displaying the high-definition photograph of him kissing her cousin. The absolute truth was staring her right in the face. She took one slow, deliberate step backward, pulling her delicate silk dress away from his reach. "Do not touch me," she whispered. Her voice was incredibly quiet, but in that moment it carried more weight than all of his frantic shouting. Preston realized he was losing his grip on his primary target. His desperation instantly morphed into raw, venomous rage. He abandoned his plea to Chloe and turned his fury completely onto me. He stormed down from the elevated head table, his fists clenched tight at his sides. He looked like an animal caught in a snare, ready to chew its own leg off to escape. "You think you are so smart, old man?" Preston snarled, closing the distance between us. "You think a fake recording and some photos are going to stop me? I have the best corporate lawyers in the state on my payroll. I will sue you for everything you own. I will take your pathetic little radio business, your house, your truck, and every dime you have hidden away in the bank. I will bury you in so much defamation litigation that you will die broke in a state facility." I stood perfectly still, my hands resting comfortably in my pockets. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not step back. I looked at this arrogant predator with the calm, immovable certainty of a father who had already won the war. "You will not be suing anyone, Preston," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly level and completely devoid of anger. "Because you can only pay lawyers with money you actually have. And as of yesterday afternoon, you do not have a single penny to your name." Preston stopped dead in his tracks. A flicker of genuine confusion crossed his furious face. Before he could process my words, a massive figure stepped out from the crowd of stunned guests. My brother-in-law Mitchell walked calmly to the front of the room. He was wearing his trademark charcoal suit, exuding an aura of absolute terrifying legal authority. He carried a thick black leather binder under his right arm. Mitchell did not yell, but the sheer gravity of his presence forced the remaining murmurs in the ballroom to die down instantly. "Hello, Preston Mitchell," said smoothly, stopping right beside me. He opened the heavy black binder and pulled out a stack of officially stamped legal documents. He held them out, forcing Preston to take them. "I suggest you read the top page. I know reading the fine print is not exactly your strong suit, but this particular document requires your immediate attention." Preston snatched the papers from Mitchell's hand. His eyes darted across the top page, and I watched the last remaining drops of blood drain entirely from his face. His mouth fell open. He looked up at Mitchell, then back down at the paper, his hands trembling so violently that the pages rustled loudly in the quiet room. For those in the back who might be confused, Mitchell announced, projecting his rich, booming voice across the country club ballroom. "Let me explain what the young groom is currently reading. 2 weeks ago, my client Harrison Caldwell generously gifted Preston a massive parcel of commercial riverfront property. Preston was so eager to expand his portfolio that he signed the deed transfer immediately without allowing independent counsel to review the liability clauses. Richard Sterling pushed his way through the crowd, his face purple with rage and panic. "What is the meaning of this, Mitchell?" Richard demanded, his voice shaking. "What did you do to my son?" "I did absolutely nothing to your son," Richard Mitchell replied, with a cold, unforgiving smile. "Your son did it to himself. That riverfront property was a designated federal Superfund site. It carries a $10 million environmental cleanup mandate issued directly by the Environmental Protection Agency. By signing that deed, Preston legally assumed total unconditional personal liability for the immediate remediation of the toxic soil. And because he failed to initiate the cleanup within the mandatory 10-day grace period which expired yesterday, the federal government has officially enacted the cross-collateralization clause buried on page 42 of the transfer agreement. Preston dropped the papers. They fluttered to the hardwood floor, landing right next to the shattered crystal of Chloe's champagne glass. "No," Preston whispered, his voice completely hollow. "No, that is impossible. The banks would never allow it." "The banks have no say in federal environmental seizures," Mitchell corrected him thoroughly, enjoying the surgical destruction of the man who tried to ruin our family. "The notices you are looking at are absolute and immediate. As of 5 o'clock this evening, every single personal bank account, corporate holding, and domestic asset tied to your name has been totally frozen by the federal government. Furthermore, because your business structure heavily intertwined your personal assets with your father's holding company, the seizure extends to the entire Sterling family estate. Your cars, your homes, your country club memberships, and your remaining liquid capital are all gone. You are completely and spectacularly bankrupt." Richard Sterling let out a strangled, breathless gasp. He clutched his chest, stumbling backward into a beautifully decorated table, sending a towering arrangement of white orchids crashing to the ground. His elite friends, the politicians and developers he had bragged to all evening, actively stepped away from him. They treated the Sterlings like toxic waste. Nobody wanted to be standing near a man whose financial empire had just been legally vaporized. The systemic karma was beautiful to witness. They had tried to use my daughter's pure heart to pay their fraudulent debts, and instead their own blinding greed had driven them straight into an inescapable trap. Preston fell to his knees. The custom-tailored tuxedo pants that he had been so incredibly proud of soaked up the spilled champagne from the floor. He looked up at me, the arrogant predator completely replaced by a pathetic, broken coward. "Harrison, please," he begged, tears streaming down his face. "You have to undo this. You have to call off your lawyers. I will leave Chloe alone. I will walk away tonight and you will never see me again. I swear to you. Just take the property back. Please, you cannot leave me with nothing." I looked down at him with absolute, unwavering resolve. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for the man sobbing at my feet. I thought about the recording, about the vicious way he had laughed at my daughter's charity work and plotted her utter devastation. "I did not take your wealth, Preston," I said, keeping my voice incredibly steady. "Your own arrogance took it. You tried to build a life on lies, manipulation, and stolen money. You thought you could target my family and walk away clean. I'm just making sure you finally pay the exact price of your admission." Before Preston could muster another pathetic plea, a loud, heavy pounding echoed from the main entrance of the grand ballroom. The massive double oak doors swung open with such tremendous force that they slammed loudly against the interior walls. The room, which had been buzzing with shocked whispers, plunged into total, terrified silence. A team of federal agents strode into the ballroom. They wore dark tactical jackets with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation printed across their backs. They moved with swift, undeniable authority, completely ignoring the wealth and status of the shocked guests surrounding them. The lead agent, a tall, stern woman with sharp eyes, walked directly toward the head table. She held a thick stack of manila folders that looked remarkably similar to the forensic audit reports Uncle Mitchell had compiled over the past 3 weeks. "Preston Sterling and Richard Sterling, the lead agent," announced her voice ringing out clearly across the silent country club. You are both under arrest for multiple counts of severe federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and massive violations of the Securities and Exchange Commission regulations." Richard let out a pathetic wail, shaking his head frantically as two armed agents approached him. "This is a mistake," he cried out, raising his hands in weak defense. "I am a respected member of this community. I demand to call my attorney right now." "You can call whoever you want from the federal holding facility," Richard, the lead agent, replied, coldly. "We have received highly verified anonymous data drops containing complete ledgers of your offshore shell companies and your Ponzi-style real estate operations over the past 5 years. We know exactly where the stolen investor funds were supposed to go." The agents grabbed Preston by his arms, hauling him roughly up from his knees. He did not fight back. The fight had been completely drained out of him the moment Mitchell handed him the foreclosure documents. He looked like a hollow, empty shell as the cold steel handcuffs clicked sharply around his wrists. The sound was incredibly satisfying, a metallic seal of permanent justice closing tight over a man who thought he was entirely above the law. Amanda, who had been cowering behind a pillar of flowers, tried to quietly slip away toward the kitchen doors, but the damage she had caused was not going to be swept under the rug. Chloe finally found her voice. My daughter stepped forward, her silk dress brushing against the shattered crystal on the floor. She looked at her cousin, the woman she had trusted more than almost anyone else in her life. Amanda froze, trapped by the profound, devastating sorrow in Chloe's eyes. Chloe did not yell, but her words cut deeper than any physical blow ever could. "You sold out your own family for money that did not even exist," Chloe said, her voice shaking, but filled with a newfound heartbreaking strength. "You are completely dead to me, Amanda. Do not ever try to contact me or my father again." Amanda broke down into loud, ugly sobs, wrapping her arms around herself as she stumbled out the side door, utterly exiled from the only family that had ever truly cared for her. She had gambled her entire soul on a wealthy predator, and she was leaving with absolutely nothing. The federal agents escorted Preston and Richard Sterling down the center aisle of the ballroom. The wealthy guests, the politicians, and the elite socialites parted like the Red Sea, staring in silent horror as the two men were paraded out in handcuffs. The illusion of their American royalty was completely dead and buried. They were no longer powerful developers. They were exposed, humiliated criminals facing decades behind bars. When the heavy oak doors finally closed behind the authorities, the grand ballroom felt incredibly vast and empty. The extravagant floral arrangements and the crystal chandeliers suddenly looked ridiculous, a cheap stage set for a play that had just been violently canceled. I turned and looked at my daughter. The tears were finally falling freely down her cheeks. I walked over and wrapped my arms tightly around her shoulders, pulling her close to my chest. She buried her face in my dark suit jacket and wept, mourning the loss of the man she thought she loved and the cousin she thought she knew. I held her firmly, resting my chin on the top of her head. I knew the pain she was feeling was immense, but I also knew it was clean pain. It was the pain of a broken bone being properly reset so it could heal perfectly straight. I had kept my promise to Sarah. I had stood between our daughter and the wolves. The predators had been systematically dismantled, stripped of their power, their wealth, and their freedom. We were safe. And as I held my daughter in the middle of that quiet, shattered room, I knew we would build an even stronger foundation tomorrow. The flashing red and blue strobes of the federal transport vehicles painted the pristine white walls of the Rosewood Estate Country Club in harsh, unforgiving colors. It was a rhythmic, pulsing light that cut right through the manufactured elegance of the evening, signaling the absolute end of the Sterling family illusion. I stood near the massive arched windows of the grand ballroom, my arm wrapped securely around my daughter, and watched the total collapse of a fraudulent empire. The air in the room, which just an hour ago had been thick with expensive cologne, roasted scallops, and suffocating arrogance, now felt incredibly clean. It felt like the crisp, sharp breeze that rolls in immediately after a violent and destructive summer thunderstorm. The heavy, oppressive static of deception had finally been cleared from the frequency. Preston Sterling, the man who had fancied himself the untouchable king of the city, was now moving toward the exit with a stumbling, uncoordinated gait. The crisp, tailored lines of his expensive custom tuxedo were completely ruined. The dark fabric bunched awkwardly around his broad shoulders because his arms were pulled tightly behind his back, secured by the cold, heavy steel of federal handcuffs. He kept his head bowed low, his chin practically resting on his chest entirely, unable to meet the eyes of the hundreds of elite guests who were now pressing themselves against the glass doors to watch his humiliating exit. This was the exact same man who had laughed so casually about draining my daughter's trust fund, the very same predator who had mocked her charitable heart in a smoke-filled room. Now violently stripped of his stolen money and his offshore shell companies, he looked remarkably small. He was just a pathetic, greedy coward taking his final, shameful steps in high society. The stunned silence of his exit was suddenly shattered by a shrill, piercing scream that echoed wildly off the vaulted ceilings of the lobby. Victoria Sterling Preston's mother burst through the crowd of onlookers like a woman entirely possessed. She was draped in heavy silk and dripping with imported diamonds, a walking billboard of the fake wealth her family had actively stolen from innocent investors. Her face, usually locked in a rigid mask of aristocratic superiority, was distorted into a grotesque portrait of absolute, unadulterated panic. "You cannot do this!" Victoria shrieked at the top of her lungs, clawing frantically at the sleeve of the senior federal agent leading the detail. "Do you have any idea who we are? We are founding members of this club. You are ruining our reputation. We host charity dinners with the mayor. You are making a terrible, embarrassing mistake, and I will personally have all of your badges for this outrage." The federal agent did not even break her steady stride. She turned her head slightly, offering Victoria a look of such absolute, chilling indifference that it stopped the older woman dead in her tracks. The agent calmly and loudly informed Victoria that the Sterling family reputation was already completely worthless and that she should highly consider retaining independent criminal defense counsel before the sun came up. Victoria let out a strangled gasp, bringing a trembling hand covered in stolen jewels to her chest. She looked around the crowded lobby, frantically seeking support or sympathy from the wealthy politicians and elite developers she had hosted at her lavish dinner parties for years. But the crowd physically recoiled from her presence. They turned their backs, averted their eyes, and whispered to one another in hushed, disgusted tones. In the brutal, unforgiving world of the social elite, the only sin worse than losing your money is being exposed as a fraud. Victoria Sterling was watching her entire universe vaporize in real time. She collapsed into a velvet lobby chair, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands, as her husband and her son were shoved roughly into the back of an armored federal transport vehicle. While the authorities effectively secured the outer perimeter of the country club, I guided Chloe gently toward the quiet sanctuary of the bridal suite to escape the prying eyes of the remaining guests. But as we crossed the vast marble expanse of the lobby, we found Amanda. She was standing entirely alone near the polished mahogany coat-check desk, her expensive custom-tailored maid of honor gown looking horribly out of place against her trembling, defeated posture. When she saw us approaching, her tear-streaked face twisted into a mask of desperate, pathetic hope. She had nowhere left to hide and no more lies to spin. She took a hesitant step forward, her hands clasped tightly together in a pleading gesture. "Uncle Harrison, Chloe, please! Amanda whimpered, her voice cracking heavily under the immense weight of her own monstrous betrayal. You have to understand my side. Preston manipulated me. He twisted my mind. He promised me things I never had growing up. I am your family. You cannot just leave me here like this. I have nowhere else to go. Chloe stopped walking. My beautiful, kind-hearted daughter looked at the cousin she had fiercely protected, generously funded, and loved unconditionally for 20 long years. The tears had completely dried on Chloe's face, leaving behind a profound, unshakable strength that made my chest swell with immense pride. Chloe did not raise her voice. She did not scream or hurl petty insults the way Amanda had done on the covert surveillance tapes. She simply looked at Amanda with a quiet, absolute finality that carried the weight of a judge rendering a verdict. You are my sister. Chloe said the words falling like heavy, solid stones onto the marble floor. We gave you absolutely everything, Amanda, and you eagerly tried to sell my entire future to buy yourself a beach house in the Caribbean. You made your choice in that hotel room when you clinked your glass with that monster. You are not my family anymore. Amanda let out a ragged, choking sob, reaching out a trembling hand toward my daughter. I stepped smoothly and decisively between them, completely blocking her path. I looked down at the woman I had helped raise, feeling absolutely zero pity or remorse for the position she was currently in. I told her that systemic karma was a perfectly balanced mathematical equation. She had deliberately tried to steal from the only people on this earth who had ever truly cared for her, and her reward was exactly what she had earned. She was walking away with absolutely nothing. There would be no trust fund, no tropical beach house, and no family left to catch her when she inevitably fell. I told her to walk out the front doors into the rain and never attempt to contact us for the rest of her natural life. We turned our backs and left Amanda standing there in the cold, cavernous lobby, weeping entirely alone. She was a ghost, haunting a party she was no longer invited to, exiled permanently from the warmth and protection of our family. The days and weeks that immediately followed the rehearsal dinner ambush were a masterclass in swift, merciless justice. My brother-in-law Mitchell and his elite team of forensic accountants handed their comprehensive, heavily documented dossiers directly to the federal prosecutors. We provided the government with a perfectly drawn, incredibly detailed map of the Sterling family's entire criminal enterprise. The sheer volume of hard evidence we had gathered from the hidden digital footprints was so overwhelming, so meticulously organized, that the government prosecutors did not even need to offer Preston or Richard a plea deal. The cold reality of the situation crashed down upon the Sterling family with the destructive, unstoppable force of an avalanche. The federal authorities moved with terrifying, unprecedented speed, executing a total, unsparing liquidation of the entire Sterling empire. Because Preston had arrogantly and blindly signed the poisoned commercial deed I had handed him at the diner, he had legally bound his personal assets to a $10 million environmental liability. That single greedy signature gave the federal government the immediate legal authority to bypass standard bankruptcy protections and seize absolutely everything in his name. I sat in the quiet comfort of my recording studio, sipping my morning coffee and reading the legal updates Mitchell sent over with a deep, resonating sense of satisfaction. The federal agents had ruthlessly foreclosed on the massive Sterling family estates. The sprawling luxury mansions with their manicured lawns, tennis courts, and heated swimming pools were seized, chained shut, and slapped with federal auction notices. The fleet of imported luxury cars they used to project their fake superiority across the city were aggressively towed away, destined to be sold to the highest bidder in order to pay back a fraction of the stolen investor capital. Even the highly secretive offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, The supposedly bulletproof Horizon Vanguard holdings that Preston had so confidently bragged about were completely dismantled. The federal investigators used Mitchell's brilliant legal tracing methods to pierce the international corporate veil, permanently freezing the hidden accounts and aggressively repatriating the stolen funds back to the United States. The Sterling family was stripped down to the absolute bare studs of their existence. They were left with zero physical assets, zero financial legacy, and a surname that was completely toxic in every banking institution across the globe. True justice was not served with clenched fists, angry shouts, or violent physical confrontations. It was served with immaculate, bulletproof paperwork and the undeniable amplified truth. Preston and Richard Sterling were firmly denied bail by a federal judge officially deemed extreme flight risks due to their international banking connections and access to private aviation. They were currently sitting in a sterile concrete federal holding facility, trading their custom-tailored tuxedos for standard-issue prison uniforms. They were facing down the absolute terrifying certainty of spending the next 3 decades of their lives in a federal penitentiary. The collapse of the Sterling Empire was not just a sudden explosion, but a methodical, agonizingly thorough societal demolition. It was a beautiful, satisfying process to witness. Every single day brought a brand new headline in the financial papers detailing another legally seized asset, another frozen bank account, or another exposed shell company. The exact same people who had clinked their crystal glasses with Richard Sterling at the country club were now tripping over themselves to give cooperative statements to the federal authorities, desperately trying to distance their own investment portfolios from the highly radioactive fallout of the Sterling name. I watched this complete societal erasure from the comfortable, quiet sanctuary of my own home. I had spent my entire life working diligently with my hands, building heavy broadcast antennas, running thousands of miles of copper wire, and mastering the complex, invisible frequencies of sound waves. I understood on a fundamental level that a strong foundation was the only thing that kept a structure standing when the heavy winds began to blow. The Sterlings had built their entire existence on a rotting foundation of lies, heavily leveraged debt, and the arrogant, foolish belief that they could simply exploit the kindness of honest people to maintain their lavish lifestyle. They had completely mistaken my quiet, humble nature for weakness. They had looked at my faded denim jacket and my calloused hands and assumed I was a naive, uneducated fool waiting to be robbed blind. They never understood that a man who knows exactly how to build complex things from the ground up also knows exactly where to strike to bring the whole structure crashing down to the earth. Victoria Sterling, permanently stripped of her sparkling diamonds and her sprawling gated estates, was forced to move into a small, cramped, rented apartment on the far outskirts of the city. Her personal bank accounts were completely drained by exorbitant legal defense fees and massive federal restitution penalties. She was permanently banned from the elite country club she had once ruled with an iron fist, actively ignored and shunned by the high society friends she had spent decades trying to impress. Her social reputation, the only currency she had ever truly valued in her life, was completely and utterly bankrupt. She was forced to live out her remaining years in the exact kind of working-class obscurity she had spent her life mocking. Amanda, the treacherous cousin who had willingly traded her soul for a percentage of a stolen inheritance, completely vanished from our lives. Word eventually filtered back through the extended family gossip that she had quietly left the state, securing a low-level administrative job in a distant city where absolutely no one knew her name. She had foolishly burned the only bridge that ever truly mattered, entirely exiling herself to a bleak life of quiet, solitary regret. She had chased a mirage of stolen wealth and ended up with a reality of profound isolation. As for my daughter, Chloe did not allow the massive betrayal to break her spirit. In the weeks following the rehearsal dinner ambush, I watched my child heal with an incredible resilient grace. The permanent removal of Preston and Amanda from her life was exactly like cutting away a heavy, suffocating vine from a brightly blooming tree. She threw herself entirely back into her charitable foundation, passionately channeling all of her energy into helping vulnerable people who genuinely needed her light. Her brilliant smile returned, shining brighter, and feeling infinitely more authentic than it had ever been during her stressful engagement to that monster. She learned a brutal lesson about trust, but she did not let the experience harden her beautiful heart. One quiet evening, as we sat together on the back wooden porch of my house, listening to the gentle hum of the cicadas in the warm southern air, Chloe leaned her head gently against my shoulder. We did not talk about the country club, the federal indictments, or the billions of dollars in frozen corporate assets. We did not need to speak of those ugly things anymore. The violent storm had completely passed over us, leaving behind a clear, beautifully unobstructed sky. I had kept my silent, sacred promise to her mother. I had stood firmly between our family and the wolves, hiding in plain sight. The predators had been systematically dismantled, thoroughly stripped of their artificial power, their stolen wealth, and their freedom. We were finally safe. And as I looked out over the quiet, peaceful land I had worked my entire life to secure, I felt a profound, absolute sense of peace settling into my bones. The radio frequencies were finally crystal clear. The heavy static of deception had been permanently erased from our lives, and the truth was broadcasting loud and clear for all to hear. The heavy, suffocating storm that had threatened to drown our family finally broke, giving way to a profound and deafening quiet. In the weeks immediately following the shattered rehearsal dinner, my home transformed into a sanctuary of slow, agonizing, but necessary healing. The massive public spectacle at the country club had surgically removed the cancer from our lives, but the physical and emotional recovery of the patient was a much longer journey. I watched my beautiful daughter wrestle with the incredibly complex grief of mourning a future that was entirely fabricated. It is a uniquely terrible kind of pain to realize that the man you loved and the cousin you trusted were nothing more than greedy actors reading from a poisoned script. We spent our nights out on the old wrap around porch of our property. The autumn air was turning crisp, and the heavy wooden rocking chairs offered a familiar, comforting rhythm. I would brew a fresh pot of dark roast coffee around midnight, and we would sit together under the vast canopy of the southern stars. We listened to the crickets and the distant rustle of the wind moving through the ancient oak trees. During those first few nights, Chloe cried until she physically could not shed another tear. She asked me the same heartbreaking questions over and over again. She asked why her love was not enough to make Preston a good man. She asked how Amanda could look her in the eye and smile while actively plotting to leave her completely bankrupt and alone. I held her hand in the dark, and I told her the absolute truth. I told her that predators do not target people because those people are weak or deficient in any way. Predators target bright, beautiful lights simply because they live in absolute darkness. I explained that Preston and Amanda were hollow, empty vessels who saw her genuine kindness as a resource to be consumed. I reminded her that her capacity to love unconditionally was her greatest strength, and I would never let the actions of two miserable criminals turn her warm heart into cold stone. Piece by piece, night after night, I sat on that porch and helped my daughter carefully rebuild her shattered confidence. It was during one of those quiet, pre-dawn hours that Chloe finally turned to me with a question that had clearly been weighing heavily on her mind. She looked at my faded denim jacket and my scuffed work boots. She looked out at my reliable, rusty Ford truck parked in the gravel driveway. She asked me why I had lived so incredibly humbly all these years, when I secretly possessed the financial power to crush a real estate empire in a matter of days. She asked why I had never showed off the massive wealth of Caldwell syndication and sound to the world. I took a slow sip of my black coffee and smiled at her. I explained the philosophy of silent wealth. I told her that loud money is nothing more than deep insecurity screaming for public validation. The Sterling family needed to drive imported sports cars and throw lavish country club parties because they were completely terrified of being exposed as failures. They used their flashy lifestyle as a shield to hide their massive debt and their moral bankruptcy. I told Chloe that true wealth is not about what you can buy to impress strangers. True wealth is absolute, quiet power. It is the ability to walk into a room and know you do not owe a single soul an explanation. Most importantly, I told her that true wealth is the ultimate power to protect the innocent people you love when the wolves finally come knocking at your door. I lived quietly because I never needed the world to know my name. I only needed to know that my family was secure. I saw a profound shift in my daughter's eyes that morning. The heavy fog of betrayal and confusion finally lifted entirely. She understood that she came from a lineage of protectors and builders, not users and manipulators. The naive, trusting girl who had been so easily charmed by high society smiles was completely gone. In her place sat a strong, fiercely intelligent young woman who truly understood the immense power of her own legacy. With her newly rebuilt confidence, Chloe decided it was time to take absolute control of the narrative. The wedding date was rapidly approaching, and all of the massive logistical deposits had already been paid in full. There was a staggering catering order designed to feed hundreds of elite guests. There were thousands of imported white orchids and roses already secured by the city florists. Preston had intentionally racked up a massive bill, assuming my daughter's trust fund would automatically cover his luxurious tastes. Instead of simply canceling the contracts and letting the vendors keep the money, Chloe made a brilliant and commanding decision. She refused to let those predators steal the resources that her family had worked so hard to build. Chloe spent an entire afternoon on the phone coordinating a massive logistical pivot. When the actual wedding day finally arrived, the lavish country club remained completely empty. Instead, the massive fleet of catering trucks was redirected to the downtown community centers and the local family shelters that Chloe had supported for years. The incredibly expensive menu of imported caviar, seared scallops, and prime roasted beef was proudly served to hundreds of local families who were currently struggling to put food on their own tables. I stood in the corner of the bustling community center gym, wearing my faded denim jacket, and watched my daughter work. She was not wearing a tragic expression or mourning a lost wedding day. She was wearing jeans and a simple cotton shirt, laughing freely as she handed out warm plates of gourmet food to single mothers and hungry children. The towering, expensive floral arrangements of white orchids that were supposed to decorate a snobbish ballroom were instead broken down and delivered to the rooms of elderly patients in the local hospital, bringing bright, beautiful colors to people who desperately needed a reason to smile. Chloe took a day that was originally designed for her complete destruction, and she miraculously transformed it into a massive celebration of human kindness. She proved to herself and to the entire city that her charitable heart was not a weakness to be exploited, but a tremendous, unshakable superpower. I had never been more incredibly proud of my child than I was in that very moment. She took the poison they tried to feed her and turned it into nourishment for the people who truly needed it. The profound success of that day ignited a massive fire within Chloe. She realized that she did not just want to volunteer her time to small local causes anymore. She wanted to utilize the full unbridled power of our family resources. The following Monday morning, Chloe walked into the downtown headquarters of Caldwell Syndication and Sound. She did not walk in bringing us coffee like she did when she was a little girl. She walked in wearing a sharp professional suit, carrying a leather briefcase that looked remarkably similar to the one her Uncle Mitchell always carried. She walked directly into my executive suite, sat down in the heavy leather producer chair opposite my desk, and outlined her vision. She officially stepped in to take over the entire philanthropic arm of our corporation. She established a heavily funded, highly aggressive charitable foundation designed specifically to provide legal and financial protection to vulnerable individuals who were being exploited by corporate predators. She used the lessons she had learned from Preston and Amanda to build a fortress for others. She became a brilliant, powerful executive in her own right, operating with the exact same quiet, lethal efficiency that our family was known for. The Sterling family faded into complete and absolute obscurity. The federal government successfully liquidated their entire remaining portfolio, ensuring that the innocent investors they had defrauded received at least a fraction of their money back. Preston and Richard were both sentenced to decades in federal prison, locked away in concrete cells where their arrogant charm and their fake wealth meant absolutely nothing. Victoria lived out her days in a cramped apartment completely erased from the high society world she had worshipped. Amanda remained permanently exiled, a cautionary tale of what happens when you trade your loyalty for the empty promise of stolen money. Justice in this world is rarely delivered with physical violence or dramatic movie shootouts. True justice is quiet. It is methodical. It is delivered through immaculate paperwork, undeniable truth, and the absolute certainty of systemic karma. You reap exactly what you sow in this life. If you build your house on a foundation of lies and manipulation, the universe will eventually send a storm strong enough to wash it all away. But if you build your life on integrity, hard work, and the fierce protection of the people you love, you will always be left standing when the wind finally stops blowing. I am just an old radio mechanic who spent his life twisting knobs and balancing audio frequencies. But I know that the truth is the loudest sound in the entire world. It cannot be buried. It cannot be hidden behind expensive suits or country club smiles. Eventually, the static always clears, and the truth broadcasts loud and clear for absolutely everyone to hear. I hope my story serves as a reminder to always trust your instincts and to protect the innocent people in your life with everything you have. Do not ever mistake a quiet, humble person for a weak one. Some of the most dangerous protectors in this world are simply wearing faded jackets and drinking cheap black coffee, waiting patiently in the shadows. If my journey resonated with your heart today, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story. I read every single message you send my way. Please tell me in the comments exactly what city or town you are watching from and what time it is there right now. It brings a tremendous amount of joy to this old father's heart to know exactly how far our message of justice and healing has traveled across the world. Thank you for sitting on the porch and listening to my story today. Until next time, stay strong, protect your family, and always remember that true wealth is found in the quiet peace of an honest life. The heavy acoustic doors of my downtown recording studio sealed shut with a soft, satisfying thud, locking the chaotic noise of the city completely outside. I walked slowly across the thick carpet, breathing in the familiar, comforting scent of warm electronics and aged acoustic foam. This room has always been my ultimate sanctuary. It is a place built entirely on the mathematical perfection of sound and the absolute clarity of truth. I stood behind the massive primary mixing console, running my calloused fingers over the hundreds of smooth metal sliders and glowing digital dials. The control room was perfectly quiet right now, but it was a rich, vibrant kind of quiet. It was the peaceful silence that only comes after a massive, destructive storm has finally blown itself out and moved off the radar. I looked through the thick, double-paned glass into the empty vocal booth where countless hours of broadcasting history had been captured over the decades. I thought about the sheer volume of voices that had passed through those microphones. Voices telling stories, sharing news, debating politics, and connecting people across thousands of miles of invisible radio frequencies. But out of all the incredible broadcasts my company has ever produced, nothing will ever be as important or as fundamentally devastating as the simple raw audio file we enhanced in this very room just a few months ago. There is a profound, undeniable honesty in the science of acoustic engineering. When a person speaks a lie, their voice carries a specific kind of dissonance. It is a subtle microscopic vibration that you might not catch with the naked ear in a crowded room. But when you strip away the ambient background noise and isolate the raw vocal frequency, the deception becomes incredibly obvious. Preston Sterling and his treacherous family built their entire existence on that kind of acoustic garbage. They layered their lives with the loud, distracting noise of expensive sports cars, imported champagne, and flashy country club memberships. They did it to mask the hollow, rotting sound of their own moral and financial bankruptcy. They truly believed that if they just played their music loud enough, no one would ever hear the structural beams of their fake empire cracking under the immense pressure of their own greed. But systemic karma operates exactly like a master audio engineer. It does not care about your social status or your expensive tuxedo. Karma patiently waits in the shadows, slowly filtering out the distractions until nothing remains except the absolute naked truth. Preston thought he was a mastermind playing a game of chess with a foolish old radio mechanic. He never once realized that men who build things with their own two hands know exactly how to deconstruct them just as easily. I sank down into the heavy leather producer chair and stared at the glowing monitors, letting the deep peace of the studio wash over my tired shoulders. Being a father is the most terrifying and rewarding job a man can ever take on in this life. From the moment I first held Chloe in my arms 30 years ago, I promised my late wife Sarah that I would shield our daughter from the ugly cruelties of the world. I worked 80-hour weeks climbing broadcast towers in the freezing rain and soldering copper wires until my fingers bled just to make sure my little girl would never know the cold bite of poverty. I wanted to build a fortress around her, but what this entire agonizing ordeal taught me is that true protection is not just about building high walls to keep the monsters out. Sometimes the monsters dress up in tailored suits and charm their way right through the front gates. They sit at your dinner table and smile at your child. True protection is having the immense, agonizing patience to stand your ground when your heart is screaming for immediate, violent revenge. When I first heard that awful recording of Preston and Amanda laughing about destroying my daughter, my initial instinct was pure primal rage. I wanted to tear that hotel room apart with my bare hands. I wanted to break him. But raw anger is a reckless, unpredictable weapon. If I had let my fury control my actions, I would have warned the predators. I would have given them the precious time they desperately needed to hide their stolen assets and deploy their corporate lawyers. Instead, I swallowed the burning bile in my throat and chose the path of silent strength. I chose to wait. I chose to meticulously build a flawless, inescapable legal trap, and then I let Preston and his blinding arrogance guide him directly into the snare. I learned that the greatest weapon a father possesses is not his physical strength, but his absolute, unshakable devotion to his child. A father's love will teach him how to be a mastermind, how to be a forensic investigator, and how to be the quiet architect of his enemy's total destruction. I look around this studio, and I see the culmination of a lifetime of honest labor. Before the syndication deals, before the massive corporate headquarters, and before the millions of dollars in philanthropic trusts, there was just me, Sarah, and a small, rusty broadcast antenna in the middle of an empty, muddy field. We built Caldwell Syndication and Sound with nothing but calloused hands, late nights, and a fierce, unwavering belief in each other. We did not inherit a fortune like Preston Sterling did. We did not have elite political connections or fancy lawyers on retainer to bail us out when things got difficult. When a storm knocked down our transmission tower in the early days, I was the one out there, in the freezing mud tightening the guy wires, while Sarah held the flashlight. We knew what it meant to struggle, and we knew what it meant to earn every single penny that went into our bank account. That kind of life builds a specific type of character. It builds a quiet, resilient strength that flashy trust fund kids will never be able to comprehend. Preston looked at my faded jeans and my scuffed boots, and he saw weakness. He saw an old, uneducated country bumpkin who could be easily separated from his life's work. He mistook my humility for stupidity. That is the fundamental flaw of people who worship money and status. They believe that if you do not wear your power on your sleeve for the whole world to see, then you must not have any power at all. They do not understand that the most dangerous man in the room is never the one shouting about his accomplishments. The most dangerous man is the one sitting quietly in the corner, observing, analyzing, and calculating his next move, while everyone else is distracted by the noise. I often replay the moment Mitchell handed Preston that black leather binder. It plays in my mind like a perfectly directed film sequence. The way the blood drained from Preston's face, the way his arrogant posture crumbled into a pathetic slouch. It was a masterclass in the delivery of consequences. We did not need to shout. We did not need to throw a single punch. We let immaculate paperwork and irrefutable federal law do the heavy lifting. That is the beauty of silent strength. When you strike with intelligence rather than raw emotion, the impact is absolute and entirely irreversible. Mitchell proved to be the ultimate guardian of our family trust, functioning as the unyielding shield that Sarah always knew he would be. And young David, my loyal audio engineer who meticulously scrubbed that country club recording until the horrible truth was laid bare, proved that family is not always defined by blood. Sometimes family is defined by the people who stand fiercely by your side when the shadows grow long. I sometimes wonder if Amanda ever truly grasps the magnitude of what she threw away. She traded a lifetime of unconditional love and unwavering support for a cheap hotel room promise that evaporated into thin air. She chose to be a parasite, and now she must navigate the world entirely alone, entirely cut off from the warmth of the Caldwell family hearth. Her name is never spoken in our home. She is a closed chapter, a lesson learned, a ghost that has been successfully exorcised from our lives. Chloe has completely replaced the space Amanda used to occupy with genuine friendships and meaningful philanthropic partnerships. I have spent the last few weeks reflecting on the concept of legacy. What do we actually leave behind when our time on this earth is finally finished? The Sterling family thought their legacy was going to be a sprawling portfolio of commercial real estate and a fancy name plastered on the side of a country club. But their actual legacy is nothing but a trail of ruined lives, empty bank accounts, and federal prison sentences. Their name has become a cautionary tale, a warning whispered among the social elite about the devastating consequences of unchecked greed. My legacy, however, is sitting right down the hall in the executive offices. My legacy is my daughter. It is the strength she showed when her world was falling apart. It is the grace she demonstrated when she canceled a lavish wedding and fed hundreds of hungry families with the catered food. It is the way she treats our employees with genuine respect, and the way she uses our family resources to protect the vulnerable. That is a legacy built on solid rock. It cannot be seized by federal agents or wiped out by a bad investment. It is permanent, and it is beautiful. I reach over and run a cleaning cloth across the surface of the audio mixing board, wiping away a tiny speck of dust. The equipment in this room is highly sensitive. It picks up the faintest whispers, the softest breaths, and the hidden frequencies that the human ear naturally filters out. In a way, this ordeal was exactly like running a diagnostic test on our lives. We cranked up the gain, we turned off the noise reduction, and we listened closely to the people surrounding us. We heard the horrible dissonant static of Preston and Amanda, but we also heard the clear resonant harmony of our true friends and our loyal colleagues like Mitchell and David. We purged the bad channels, and now the music of our lives is playing perfectly clear. I think about my late wife Sarah constantly these days. I like to imagine her standing right beside me, leaning against the doorway of the vocal booth, watching our daughter thrive. She would have been so incredibly proud of the way Chloe handled the devastating heartbreak of Betrayal. Sarah always taught Chloe that true elegance is found in the way you treat people who have absolutely nothing to offer you in return. Preston and Amanda treated people like disposable stepping stones, using manipulation as a currency to buy their way into a life they did not actually earn. Their punishment was not handed down by a vengeful father. Their punishment was the natural mathematical result of their own putrid choices. There is a profound beauty in the quiet aftermath of justice. I do not have to worry about my daughter's future anymore. I do not have to wonder if the man holding her hand is secretly holding a knife behind his back. The air is clean. The threat has been completely neutralized. I can finally just be a father again. I can sit on my porch, drink my coffee, and watch my child conquer the world on her own terms. The massive corporate apparatus that we built from a single rusty antenna has fulfilled its most sacred purpose. It protected my bloodline. As I power down the studio monitors and prepare to head home for the evening, I want to leave you with a final thought. We live in a world that constantly tries to tell us that the loudest, most aggressive people are the ones who win. We are told that kindness is a liability, and that humility is just another word for weakness. But do not ever let the cynical noise of the world convince you to compromise your integrity. If you do the right thing, if you protect the people you love with fierce, silent patience, and if you let the truth be your ultimate guide, you will always prevail. The monsters of this world might win a few early battles, but they will inevitably drown in the deep, treacherous waters of their own lies. Did you like my story? It just goes to show that a father's love paired with a little patience and a lot of preparation can stop any monster in their tracks. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button to bring a smile to this old broadcaster's face. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss out on our upcoming life stories. And let's meet down in the comments. Tell me which city or state you are watching this video from, and what time it is right now where you are. I love seeing how far these broadcasts travel across the country. Stay safe, protect your family, and I will see you in the next story. With love and respect.